Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're going to step into a world of incredible opulence, of breathtaking power, and of a kind of quiet, grinding, psychological warfare that was waged not with cannons, but with candlestick holders and bows. We're going to journey to the court of Versailles, a place that was less a palace and more a magnificent machine, engineered by one man to domesticate the most dangerous creatures in his kingdom, the French nobility. It's a story of remarkable vision, of sheer grit and ingenuity, and it all began with the fears of a young boy who would one day call himself the Sun King. Before we get lost in the gilded hallways, if you're enjoying these little late-night history trips, maybe consider giving this video a like and subscribing if you haven't. It's a small thing, but it really does help our quiet little corner of the internet grow. And as always, I love seeing where you're all listening from. It's a wonderful thought, all of us scattered across the globe in different time zones, settling in for the night together. So just drop a comment with your city or country. It's nice to know we're all in this together. Alright, now find your spot, dim the lights, maybe pull the blanket up a little higher, turn on a fan for that soft background hum, if you like. Get comfortable and let your mind relax. There's nothing else you need to do right now. Just breathe and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Chapter 1. The Sun King's Golden Cage, forging a court from paranoia and power. To understand Versailles, you have to understand that it wasn't born from a desire for a bigger house. It was born from trauma. It was forged in the fires of paranoia, in the lingering, bitter memory of a child king being forced to flee his own bedroom in the middle of the night. Before Louis XIV was the Sun King, the magnificent absolute monarch of France, he was just a boy who happened to be king. Yes, but a boy nonetheless, and his childhood was anything but peaceful. He grew up in Paris, in the royal palaces of the Louvre and the Palais Royal. And Paris in the mid-17th century, well, Paris had no chill. It was a sprawling, chaotic, magnificent and deeply dangerous city. It was a tangle of narrow, muddy streets, teeming with life, with ambition, with resentment. It was a city that could love its king one day and raise a mob against him the next. And for a young Louis, this wasn't just a political theory, it was terrifyingly real. Between 1648 and 1653, France convulsed with a series of civil wars that history politely calls the Fronde. It was, for lack of a better term, a national nervous breakdown. The word fronde itself literally means slingshot, the kind used by street urchins to hurl rocks, and that's a perfect metaphor for what happened. It was a messy, disorganized and deeply personal rebellion, where everyone from the highest princes of the blood to the Parisian shopkeepers felt they had a right to hurl rocks at the authority of the crown. Imagine you're 10 years old. You are by divine right the ruler of the most powerful kingdom in Europe, and yet one night a mob of angry Parisians smelling of wine and righteous fury breaks into your palace. They aren't there to overthrow you, not exactly. They're there to make sure you haven't fled the city. They storm the corridors, their torches casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the tapestries, and they force their way into your royal bedchamber. Your mother, the Regent Anne of Austria, and her chief minister, the deeply unpopular Cardinal Mazarin, have no choice but to let them in. They tell you to pretend to be asleep, and so you lie there, under the heavy silks, your eyes squeezed shut, feigning sleep while the leaders of the mob shuffle up to your bed. You can probably hear their heavy breathing, smell the damp wool of their coats. They hold their lanterns over your face, staring at you, this child who is supposed to be their master, to confirm that you are, in fact, still their prisoner. We've all had nightmares, but imagine your nightmare is real. Imagine the monster under the bed is an entire city, and that city is your own capital. Imagine the profound, bone-deep humiliation of it all. This event, and others like it during the Fronde, being chased from your home, seeing the loyalty of your own family members waver, watching the great nobles of the realm treat the crown not as a sacred trust but as a prize to be fought over. It all carved something deep into the psyche of the young Louis. It taught him 3 lessons that he would never ever forget. First, that Paris was a fickle, dangerous beast that could not be trusted. It had to be kept at arm's length. Second, that the French nobility, his own cousins and peers, were not loyal partners in governance. They were hungry wolves, constantly testing the fences of their enclosure, ready to tear the kingdom apart for their own power and prestige. And third, and most importantly, that true power wasn't just about having an army or passing laws. True power was about control, absolute control, the kind of control where rebellion doesn't simply fail, it becomes unthinkable. As Louis grew into a man and took the reins of power for himself in 1661, after the death of Cardinal Mazarin, these lessons became the foundation of his entire political philosophy. He was charming, he was intelligent, he was disciplined, but beneath the velvet and gold, there was a core of cold, hard steel, forged in the terror of the Fronde. He was determined that no king of France would ever again have to pretend to be asleep, while a mob inspected him like livestock. He needed a new stage for his monarchy, a place away from the volatile streets of Paris, a place where the rules were not set by ancient tradition or mob sentiment, but by him and him alone. He needed a cage, a beautiful, glittering, golden cage, and he knew just where to build it. About 13 miles southwest of Paris, there was a small village called Versailles. It was situated in a swampy, marshy, thoroughly unpromising piece of land. His father, Louis XIII, had built a small hunting lodge there. It was a modest affair, made of brick and stone, a place to get away from the pressures of the court, to chase stags, and to enjoy the rustic life. It was what you might call a royal man cave. It was functional, private, and utterly insignificant in the grand scheme of French politics, and that's precisely why Louis XIV chose it. It was a blank canvas. It had no political history, no entrenched factions, no association with the humiliations of the past. It was his, and on this swampy, unremarkable patch of land, he decided he would build not just a palace, but a new universe, with himself at its very centre. The project was, by any rational measure, insane. The scale of the ambition was almost impossible to comprehend. He wasn't just renovating a building, he was commanding a new reality into existence. The first order of business was to literally fight the landscape. The ground at Versailles was waterlogged and unstable. The surrounding area was a dense, unruly forest. Louis hired an army of architects, artists, and engineers, led by the brilliant trio of Louis Le Vau for architecture, Charles Lebrun for the interiors and art, and André Lenaut for the gardens. But the real work was done by an actual army of labourers. At its peak, more than 30,000 workers, soldiers, farmers, craftsmen toiled on the site. They moved hills, they drained swamps, a Herculean task that bred fevers and cost the lives of thousands of workers who were essentially treated as expendable. They rerouted rivers to feed the hundreds of fountains that were to be the garden's crowning glory. They transplanted entire forests, literally digging up tens of thousands of mature trees from other parts of France and dragging them on carts to be replanted at Versailles, creating instant manicured woodlands. This wasn't gardening, it was an act of conquest. And that was the entire point. The gardens of Versailles, designed by Lenaut, are perhaps the purest expression of Louis's philosophy. Before Versailles, the fashionable garden style was more intimate, more winding, more natural. Lenaut's design was a declaration of war on nature itself. Everything is built on a massive east-west axis that seems to stretch to infinity. The lawns are perfect geometric shapes. The hedges are carved into rigid, unnatural walls. The trees are planted in perfect straight lines. The Grand Canal is a vast, cruciform mirror of water that slices through the landscape, reflecting the sky and the palace. Standing on the central balcony of Versailles and looking out over these gardens was meant to be a profound political lesson. The message was clear. If I, the king, can impose this level of perfect, rational, absolute order on the chaos of nature, on swamps and forests and rivers, imagine the order I can impose on you, the people of France. The gardens were a metaphor for absolutism. They were beautiful, yes, but it was a cold, imposing and deeply intimidating beauty. It was the beauty of pure, unopposed power. And then there was the palace itself. Louis began by expanding his father's modest hunting lodge, wrapping it in a new, grand stone envelope. But this was just the beginning. Over decades, the palace grew and grew, sprouting new wings, new courts, new chapels, new opera houses. It became a sprawling city of stone and glass and gold. Louvois and his successor, Jules Hardouin-Mansart, created a masterpiece of French Baroque architecture, a style that was designed to overwhelm the senses, to awe the visitor into a state of submission. Everywhere you looked, there was a symbol of the king's power. The gates were gilded with gold leaf that shone in the sun. The ceilings were covered in vast, heroic paintings by Lebrun, depicting Louis as a Roman emperor, as a Greek god, as Apollo, the god of the sun, around whom everything revolved. This wasn't subtle. The Sun King nickname wasn't something historians came up with later. It was a carefully curated brand, and Versailles was his corporate headquarters. The sun emblem was everywhere. On doorknobs, on railings, on tapestries. The palace was a relentless 24/7 advertising campaign for the glory of Louis XIV. But the true genius and the true terror of Versailles wasn't in its art or its gardens. It was in its floor plan. The architecture was an instrument of social and political control, as meticulously designed as the gardens. At the very heart of the palace, on the upper floor, at the dead centre of the entire complex, was one room, the king's bedchamber. The whole of Versailles, this massive sprawling edifice, was designed to radiate outwards from the place where the king slept. This was no accident. It was the symbolic anchor of the entire kingdom. Just as the sun was the centre of the solar system, the king was the centre of France. Each morning, his waking the ceremony of the lever was a public spectacle that symbolized the sun rising over his kingdom. Each evening, his going to bed, the coucher, was the sun setting. The life of the state was literally tied to the king's daily routine, but the layout served a much more practical and much more sinister purpose. Versailles was built to house not just the king and his family, but the entire upper echelon of the French nobility. Thousands of them. Louis built vast wings of apartments ranging in size and luxury, which he would grant to his courtiers. To be a great noble in France now meant you had to live at Versailles. You had to leave your own great chateaux, your regional power bases where your family had ruled for centuries, and come to live in what was essentially a glorified royal dormitory. Why would they do this? Because Louis engineered a system where all power, all prestige, all wealth flowed directly from him. If you wanted a promotion for your son in the army, you had to be at Versailles to ask the king. If you wanted a lucrative government contract, you had to be at Versailles. If you wanted your daughter to marry well, you had to be at Versailles. If you wanted anything at all, you had to be physically present in the king's orbit. To be absent from court was to be forgotten. It was, as one courtier famously said, to be a non-person. And once he had them there, the architecture did the rest of the work. The palace was a labyrinth of interconnected state apartments, galleries and antechambers. There was very little privacy. The walls were thin, servants were everywhere, and their loyalty was to the king. Everyone was watching everyone else, all the time. To get from your apartment to the chapel, or to dinner, you had to pass through a series of public rooms where you would be seen, noted, and judged. Your expression, your clothes, the people you spoke to, everything was information. The most famous of these spaces is the Hall of Mirrors, the Galerie des Glaces. It's a breathtakingly beautiful room, a long gallery with 17 massive arched windows looking out onto the gardens, and directly opposite those 17 windows are 17 equally massive arched mirrors. The effect is dazzling. The room is flooded with light, the garden is reflected infinitely, and the whole space seems to dissolve into a shimmering spectacle of gold and glass. But it was also a tool of surveillance. In the Hall of Mirrors, you could not hide. The mirrors reflected everything. A whispered conversation in a corner would be visible to someone across the room. A secret glance, a subtle gesture, it was all captured and reflected in the glass. It was the 17th century equivalent of a CCTV system. It was a space designed for performance. You were constantly on stage, and the audience was everyone, including quite possibly the king himself, who would pass through the hall on his way to the chapel each day. This was the genius of Louis's golden cage. He hadn't outlawed the nobility. He hadn't stripped them of their titles. He had done something far more clever. He had neutralized them by transforming them. He took these proud, arrogant warrior aristocrats, men whose grandfathers had waged war against the crown, and he turned them into competitive interior decorators and fashion critics. Their new battlefields were not the fields of Flanders, but the slippery floors of the state apartments. Their new weapons were not swords, but a well-timed witticism, a perfectly executed bow, or the ability to secure an invitation to a private royal dinner. Their entire existence was reoriented around the king's person. Their ambition was channeled into a frantic, endless competition for trivial royal favours. The ultimate prize might be the honour of being chosen to hold the king's candlestick while he got ready for bed. This sounds absurd to us now, like a ridiculous Monty Python sketch, but at Versailles it was a deadly serious game. To be granted that honour meant you had the king's favour. It meant you had access. It meant you were for that moment more important than the hundreds of other dukes and counts standing in the room, watching you with burning envy. They traded real, autonomous power, the power they once wielded on their own estates, for the illusion of power at court. They were so busy fighting each other for scraps of royal attention that they had no time, no energy, and no opportunity to unite and plot against the king. They were trapped by their own pride, their own greed, and their own desperate need to be seen as important. They were prisoners in the most beautiful prison ever built. Louis had learned the lesson of the Fronde. He had taken the snarling wolves of the French aristocracy, and through the brilliant application of architecture, etiquette, and psychology, he had turned them into pampered, declawed lapdogs. They lived in splendour, they wore the finest clothes, they ate the best food, but they had lost the one thing that had once made them so dangerous: their independence. The construction of Versailles was more than just the biggest building project of the century. It was the forging of a new kind of monarchy. It was the physical manifestation of an idea that the king was not just the head of state, but the state itself. Every stone, every fountain, every mirror was a testament to his absolute power. He had taken the chaos he remembered from his childhood, the mobs in the streets, the treacherous nobles, and replaced it with a world of perfect, predictable, and soul-crushing order. And for the next chapter in our story, we will venture inside this golden cage and explore the bizarre, brutal, and often baffling rules of etiquette that governed every single moment of life within its walls. The system was about to begin, and it would run for nearly a century, a magnificent gleaming machine powered by human ambition and fear. Chapter 2: The Performance of Presence. Life within the ritual machine. So, let's step inside. Let's imagine we are a gear in that magnificent gleaming machine, feeling the first tremor of its daily start, because this machine, powered by ambition and fear, wasn't some abstract concept. It was a daily, hourly, minute-by-minute reality. It was a clockwork universe where the sun was quite literally the Sun King, and every other planetoid, every moon, every speck of dust in that solar system had to align itself to his rising and his setting. Survival, let alone success, at Versailles was not a matter of brilliant conversation or political cunning in the way we might think of it. It was, first and foremost, a performance of presence. You had to be there, you had to be seen being there, and you had to be seen being there in precisely the right way, at precisely the right moment. It was a relentless 24/7 audition for a part you could lose at any second. And the curtain for this grand, exhausting play rose every single morning in the king's own bedchamber. The ceremony was called the lever, which simply means the rising or the getting up, a charmingly simple name for what was arguably the most complex and politically charged alarm clock in human history. Forget a gentle chime or the smell of coffee. The king's day began with the quiet shuffling of the most powerful men in France, all vying for the honour of watching him open his eyes. It began in the dark, long before the first hint of dawn touched the gilded rooftops. A valet would be sleeping on a truckle bed at the foot of the king's magnificent balustraded bed, a bed that was less a piece of furniture and more a theatrical stage. This valet's entire job was to be there, a human snooze button, waiting for the king's first stirrings. At the appointed time, around 8 o'clock, he would whisper, "Sire, it is time," and with that, the machine would begin to turn. The lever was not a single event. Oh no, that would be far too simple, far too egalitarian. It was a finely graded process, divided into a series of exclusive viewings, like a movie premiere with different tiers of access, from the VIP cast and crew screening to the general public. This was the privilege of the entrees, the right of entry, and it was a system of 6, count them, 6 distinct stages. The first was the entrée familière. This was the ultimate backstage pass. It was granted only to the most intimate members of the royal family, the king's children, his grandchildren, along with a few key figures like the first physician and the first surgeon. They would enter the still dim room while the king was, for all intents and purposes, still in bed. The doctors would give him a brief checkup, perhaps a rub-down with rosewater. It was a quiet, almost domestic scene, but make no mistake, every person in that room was acutely aware of their unbelievable privilege. To be there was to be family, or as good as. Then came the grand entree. The doors would open to admit the Grand Chamberlain, the chief officers of the king's wardrobe, and a handful of the highest-ranking nobles who had been granted this specific honour. This is where the real business began. The king would receive holy water and say his morning prayers, while these powerful men stood by in reverent silence. It was their job to see the king commune with God before he communed with France. Next, the premiere entree. This was for a slightly wider but still incredibly elite circle. Readers, certain secretaries, and other favoured courtiers. Now the king would be officially getting up. The first valet would pull back the bed curtains, and the performance would truly begin. The king would be helped out of his nightshirt, a garment that was, by the way, probably worth more than a peasant's entire farm, and a fresh one would be presented. And this is where we see the machine's true maddening genius. The simple act of putting on a shirt became a ballet of hierarchical importance. The honour of handing the king his daytime shirt belonged to the highest-ranking person in the room. If it was one of the king's sons or grandsons, they had the right. If not, it fell to the next duke in line. It was a silent, daily refreshed org chart of who was most in favour. Imagine the tension. You're a duke. You've spent a fortune on your clothes. You've been practicing your deferential bow for weeks. You're standing there, heart-pounding, and the Grand Chamberlain bypasses you to offer the folded linen to the visiting prince of some minor German state. It was a public demotion, a snub delivered via cotton. The psychological weight of that moment, the gossip that would ripple through the chateau for the rest of day. Did you see? The Duc de Rohan was passed over for the shirt. It was a polite form of psychological warfare that kept everyone on their toes. After the shirt came the fourth entry, the entrée de la chambre. Now the room starts to fill up. Most of the great officers of the crown, ministers and other high-ranking nobles pour in. The king is now being dressed. A valet presents his breeches. Another holds his waistcoat. The royal barber shaves him, a process watched by dozens of silent, judging eyes. Each item of clothing, each dab of the razor, was a small, ritualized play in itself. And here we must pause to consider the sensory experience. The room would have been fragrant, not necessarily in a good way. You have dozens of men, all packed together. They are all wearing heavy wigs powdered with flour, which would shed a fine dust into the air. They are doused in heavy perfumes, a necessity to mask the fact that full-body bathing was, shall we say, not a daily priority. The air would be thick with the scent of musk, ambergris and unwashed humanity, all mingling with the smell of the king's morning bouillon being brought in. It was a potent, close atmosphere, the smell of power itself. Finally, the fifth and most crowded entry, the entrée. The doors were thrown open wide, and it felt like half the court flooded in. Now, a sea of lesser nobles, foreign ambassadors, military officers, and anyone with a remote claim to being important, stood shoulder to shoulder in the antechambers, craning their necks for a glimpse of the king. He would be finishing his dressing now, buckling his shoes, accepting his sword, choosing a cravat. He would announce his plans for the day. I will hunt, or there will be a council meeting. Each word was a command that set hundreds of people into motion. There was technically a sixth entry, which was basically everyone else who had managed to get into the palace, all standing in the Great Hall of Mirrors, hoping to catch a glimpse of him as he finally emerged from his chambers to walk to mass. Think about the sheer manpower and psychic energy devoted to this one act. Getting dressed, for you and me, it's a private 5-minute affair. For Louis XIV, it was a 2-hour public spectacle that reaffirmed the entire social and political structure of his kingdom, every single day. By the time he was fully dressed, he hadn't just put on clothes. He had reminded every single important person in France of their exact place in his universe. He knew who was there. He knew who was missing. A glance, a nod, a brief word. "Good morning, Marquis," could make a man's career. To be ignored for a week straight could be a death sentence for one's ambitions. It was the most important meeting of the day, and the agenda was simply proximity to the king. After the lever, the king would proceed to the chapel for mass. This was not a moment for quiet, personal reflection. This too was a performance, The king sat in the royal gallery, looking down upon the court, but the courtiers weren't looking at the priest. They were looking at the king, and the king in turn was looking at God. It was a perfect triangular display of power. The court adored the king, who in turn showed his piety to God, reinforcing the idea of his divine right to rule. Even prayer was a public relations exercise. Courtiers would note his level of devotion. Was he distracted? Did he seem particularly pious today? Everything was data. Everything was a clue to his mood, his intentions. Following Mass, the day's business would begin. On council days, Louis would meet with his ministers. These were working meetings, but even here the ritualistic element was present. Ministers didn't just walk in and sit down. They stood, hats in hand, unless specifically invited to be seated. They presented their reports with a kind of formalized grace. Louis was famously diligent, a micromanager of his own kingdom, but even as he worked, he was being watched. Courtiers would gather outside the council chamber, waiting for it to end, trying to read the expressions on the ministers' faces as they emerged. Was the news from the Spanish front good? Did the finance minister look worried? The palace was a vast echo chamber of gossip, speculation and intelligence gathering. On other days, the main event might be a hunt. This was not a casual afternoon of sport. It was a military operation on horseback. Hundreds of courtiers would don their elaborate hunting attire and thunder across the countryside in pursuit of a stag. Again, this was a chance to be seen, to ride well, to keep up with the king, to be there at the kill. It was another opportunity to earn that precious commodity, a moment of the king's attention. For the ladies of the court, it was a chance to look fetching in a carriage, to wave a handkerchief at the right moment. It was all part of the show. But perhaps the most bizarre and telling of all the daily rituals were the king's meals. We think of eating as a private, or at least a semi-private, activity. For Louis XIV, it was a spectator sport. The main meal of the day, dinner, which was eaten around 1 in the afternoon, was known as the grand couvert. Imagine this scene. The king sits alone at a table set for one, though sometimes the queen or other very high-ranking royals might join him. The table is laden with a truly staggering amount of food. A typical meal might involve several courses, with dozens of dishes per course. Soups, pâtés, roast pheasants, fish, mountains of vegetables, and elaborate sugar sculptures. Before he could eat a bite, however, a procession of servants would bring in the dishes. The ritual of the nef, a locked vessel containing the king's cutlery and spices, would be enacted to show that everything was secure. Officers would taste the dishes to ensure they weren't poisoned. All of this happened with the solemnity of a high religious ceremony. And who was watching this? The public, or at least the public of Versailles. A crowd of courtiers would be permitted to file into the antechamber where the king ate. They would stand behind a balustrade, watching in absolute silence. It was considered a great honor to have the right to watch the king eat his soup. Think about that for a moment. You would put on your finest, most uncomfortable clothes, stand for an hour in a crowded, stuffy room, just to watch another man chew. You were not allowed to speak. You were simply there to bear witness to the royal digestion. The silence was a key part of it. The only sounds were the scrape of the king's silver cutlery on the plate, and perhaps his occasional request to a valet for more wine. It created an atmosphere of intense, focused awe. It reduced everyone in the room to the status of a mere observer. They were not participants, they were an audience. It was another daily reminder that he was the center of the world, and they were merely satellites. Now, within this bizarre world of public dining and ritualized dressing, there existed a social currency so powerful, so sought after, that it drove women to feats of political maneuvering, backstabbing, and sheer endurance that would make a modern CEO blush. I am talking, of course, about the tabouret, the privilege of the stool. On the surface, it sounds almost comically mundane. A tabouret was a small, backless, folding stool. That's it. A piece of furniture you might buy today for a camping trip. But at the court of Versailles, this humble object was the holy grail for aristocratic women. The privilege of the stool was the right for a woman to be seated in the presence of the queen, or, in some cases, the king. In a world where everyone else was required to stand, often for hours on end, the simple act of sitting down was a mark of supreme status. It was a public declaration that you were not just part of the herd, you were someone. The right was not given lightly. It was generally reserved for the wives of dukes and foreign princes, but it could also be granted by the king as a special favor. and oh, the things women would do to get it. To receive the tabouret was the culmination of a life's ambition for many noble women. It meant you had arrived. It meant you could sit during the Queen's card games, during her receptions, during those long, tedious hours of simply being present. It elevated you above the sea of standing, sweating, exhausted women who made up the bulk of the court. It was a visible, undeniable symbol of your rank and favour. The fight for a stool could consume families for generations. It involved intricate lobbying, strategic marriages, and vast expenditures on gifts and bribes. If a family was elevated to the rank of duke, the first and most important consequence was that the new duchess would receive her tabouret. The day she was first granted this right was a major social event. She would enter the Queen's chambers, and the First Lady-in-Waiting would ceremoniously offer her the stool. She would sit for a moment, basking in the glory and the envy of every other woman in the room. To lose the privilege was a catastrophe. It was a public shaming of the highest order. It meant your family had fallen from grace. The absence of that little stool was as loud and clear a message as any royal decree. This obsession with a simple piece of furniture reveals the psychological core of Versailles. In an environment of absolute monarchy, where real political power had been stripped from the nobility, status became everything. And status was measured not in land or armies anymore, but in these tiny symbolic gestures of royal favour. Could you hand the king his shirt? Could you watch him eat his pheasant? Could your wife sit down in a crowded room? These were the new battlegrounds. The stool wasn't just a stool, it was a throne in miniature, a tiny island of prestige in a vast ocean of subservience. As the afternoon wore on, the performance continued. The king might take a walk in the gardens, and a select group would be invited to trail behind him, a human comet's tail of silk and wigs. He might visit his current mistress, a journey that was also public knowledge, and a key part of the court's power dynamics. Who was in favour? The king's wife, the queen, or his official mistress? A complex and often bitter rivalry played out between these women and their respective factions, all under the watchful eye of the court. A nod from the mistress could be just as valuable as a word from a minister. And as evening fell, the entire machine began to run in reverse. The day concluded with the cocher, the going-to-bed ceremony, which was an almost perfect mirror image of the lever. It began with the king's supper, another public meal, though perhaps slightly less formal than the grand couvert. Afterwards, he would spend some time with his family in his private chambers. This was one of the few relatively relaxed moments of the day, a brief interlude of something approaching normal domestic life. But then the ritual would reassert itself. Around 10 o'clock, the court would once again assemble for the culture. Just as with the lever, it was a multi-stage process. First, the king would enter his bedchamber and make a grand public farewell to the assembled courtiers. He would bow, and they would all bow in return. This was the signal for the vast majority to leave. Then, a smaller, more privileged group, similar to the one at the grand entrée in the morning, would remain for the more intimate stages of the ceremony. The king would say his prayers, seated in an armchair. Then he would begin to undress. And here, again, we find a ritual of immense political weight, masquerading as a simple, everyday act. This was the ceremony of the bourgeois, the candlestick. Every evening, as the king prepared for bed, he would designate one courtier from the assembled group to hold the candlestick that would light him to his bed. This was it. This was the final lottery of the day. The king would survey the room, a sea of hopeful, anxious faces. Then he would utter a name. Monsieur de Saint-Simon, perhaps. The chosen man would step forward, his heart likely pounding in his chest. A valet would hand him the silver candlestick, with its single burning candle, and he would have the supreme honour of lighting the king's way from his chair to his bedside. It sounds absurd to us, the honour of being a human lampstand, but to them it was everything. To be chosen for the candlestick meant you were the last person the king had officially recognised that day. It was a sign of immediate favour, a signal to the entire court that you were at that moment on the king's mind. The man who held the candlestick would be surrounded by well-wishers and favour-seekers the next morning. His stock would have risen dramatically overnight. It was the 17th century equivalent of being the last person the CEO talks to before leaving the office for the night. It was a sign, and everyone at Versailles was a professional semiotician, an expert in reading signs. After the candlestick holder had performed his solemn duty, The king would get into bed. The first valet would draw the bed curtains. The machine would finally mercifully grind to a halt. The courtiers would file out, whispering about the day's events, already calculating their strategies for tomorrow's lever. Who was up? Who was down? Who got the shirt? Who held the candle? The great gilded cage of Versailles would settle into a restless slumber, ready to begin the entire exhausting performance again in just a few short hours. Living in this system was like being an actor in a play that never ended, for which you were never allowed to forget your lines. Every gesture was choreographed. Every word had a potential double meaning, a misplaced bow, an inappropriate smile, wearing the wrong color ribbons. Any of these could be a fatal misstep. The psychological toll must have been immense. This was a life lived entirely on the surface, a life of constant grinding anxiety. You were always on display, always being judged, not just by the king but by your rivals. Your friends were not really your friends. They were your allies of convenience. Gossip was not idle chatter. It was a weapon, the primary currency of information and influence. A whispered rumor in the Hall of Mirrors could destroy a reputation built over years. And behind the facade of gilded splendor, there was a great deal of physical discomfort. The palace was famously cold and drafty in the winter. The sheer size of the rooms and the single-paned glass windows made them impossible to heat. Courtiers would huddle near the few fireplaces, their backs freezing while their fronts roasted. In the summer, the heat, the crowds, and the primitive sanitation created an overwhelming stench that the gallons of perfume could never truly conquer. Life was also ruinously expensive. To be a courtier at Versailles was to be engaged in a constant arms race of fashion. You needed a different, impossibly elaborate outfit for every occasion. You needed to maintain a household of servants, a stable of horses, and a carriage. You were expected to gamble at the king's card tables, and crucially, to lose gracefully to him and his family. Most of the old nobility bankrupted themselves trying to keep up. This, of course, was exactly what Louis wanted. A bankrupt nobleman was a dependent nobleman. He was a man who relied on the king's favour, on a royal pension or a sinecure to survive. He was a man who could not afford to go back to his country estates and raise an army against the crown. The entire system was designed to turn the most dangerous men in France into fawning, debt-ridden petitioners, all fighting over the honour of holding a candlestick. So when we look back at the pomp and the ritual, the lever and the couche, the tabouret and the bourgeois, it's easy to dismiss it as absurd and ridiculous. And in many ways it was, but it was also a deadly serious game. It was a finely tuned instrument of control, a ritual machine that Louis XIV designed with the brilliance of a master engineer. He took the violent, chaotic and treacherous ambitions of the French aristocracy and channeled them into this hermetically sealed world of etiquette. He replaced the sword with the well-turned compliment, the battlefield with the ballroom. He created a world where a man's worth was measured by his proximity to the royal body. To be near the king, to see him, to be seen by him, that was the only thing that mattered. And in doing so, he ensured that for as long as he lived, all eyes in France would be fixed, not on rebellion or conspiracy, but on the closed door of the royal bedchamber, waiting with bated breath for the first turn of the great machine, for the first whisper of "Sire, it is time." The performance was everything, and the price of a bad review was oblivion. And for the courtiers trapped within this golden cage, the most terrifying thought was not the exhaustion of the performance, but the silence that would follow if they were ever cast out of the show. Chapter 3. A Theatre of Cruelty. Favour, Disgrace and Social Ruin. The silence. We often seek it out, don't we? We buy noise-cancelling headphones. We go on quiet retreats. We cherish those rare moments when the clamour of the world recedes and leaves us with our own thoughts. But the silence that followed being cast out of the show at Versailles was a different beast entirely. It wasn't a peaceful, meditative silence. It was a smothering, absolute void. It was the sound of your universe imploding. It was the sound of your own social death. Imagine you've spent your entire life in the loudest, most brilliantly lit concert hall in the world. Every moment is filled with music, conversation, the rustle of silk, the clink of glasses. Your entire sense of self is tied to your seat in the orchestra, to the part you play in the symphony. Then, one day, without warning, you are picked up and placed outside in a soundproofed room. The music stops. the light vanishes. All you can hear is the frantic, useless beating of your own heart. That was disgrace at Versailles. It wasn't just losing your job, it was being unplugged from reality itself. To understand the terrifying depth of the fall, we first have to understand the dizzying height of the pinnacle. Royal favour wasn't just a nice-to-have, like getting a good performance review from your boss. It was the animating force of a courtier's existence. The king, particularly Louis XIV, was not just a monarch, he was the sun. The Sun King wasn't a clever nickname, it was a cosmological and political fact. He was the centre of their universe, and everything light, warmth, life, money, status, purpose radiated from him. To be in his favour was to be bathed in that life-giving light. To be out of it was to be cast into the freezing outer darkness of deep space. Your entire day, as we've seen, was structured around proximity to this sun. The closer you orbited, the warmer you were. The ultimate goal was to be a planet in the inner solar system, basking in the daily glow. Disgrace meant your orbit had decayed. You were being flung out past the Kuiper belt, destined to become a cold, irrelevant wanderer in the void. And the fall rarely began with a dramatic thunderclap. There was no formal memo, no HR meeting. It began with whispers, with subtle shifts in atmospheric pressure that only the exquisitely sensitive barometers of the court could detect. It began with the little things. Perhaps one morning during the laver, the king's eyes, which normally would have rested on you for a brief, affirming moment as you helped with his sleeve, simply didn't. They looked through you, as if you were a pane of particularly uninteresting glass. Your heart would do a little flip-flop of pure, cold dread. Was it a mistake? Was he merely distracted? Or was this it? Then the next day, at supper, he might ask the Duke standing next to you about his son's recent marriage, a detail he would have normally asked of you. The chill intensifies. It's like feeling the first hints of a fever. A few days later, a minor but desirable appointment. The governorship of a small, forgotten town. Something you had been angling for is given to a rival, a man you considered your inferior. Now the fever is spiking. The entire court, which operates like a single, hyper-aware organism, notices. They see the king's gaze slide past you. They note the conversation you weren't included in. And the great, slow, merciless turning begins. People who once sought you out in the Hall of Mirrors suddenly find their attention captured by a tapestry on the opposite wall as you approach. Friends who had promised to join you for a game of cards are suddenly terribly sorry, but a prior engagement they had completely forgotten about has just come up. Your own antechamber, the small waiting room outside your apartments, which was once a hub of clients and favour seekers, a measure of your influence, starts to empty. At first it's just less crowded, then there are only one or two hopefuls. Finally, it is silent. You sit in your grand apartment, surrounded by exquisite furniture that you're probably still paying for, and the only sound is the ticking of a clock, marking the seconds of your social extinction. This was the contagion of disgrace. It was a communicable disease, and no one wanted to risk infection. To be seen with a man on whom the sun no longer shone was to risk having that shadow fall upon you as well. It was a ruthless form of social quarantine, and it was all orchestrated by the quiet, almost casual whims of one man. Louis XIV was a master of the understated execution. He rarely needed to shout. His displeasure was a stiletto, not a broadsword, and it was all the more terrifying for its precision. A courtier, perhaps having grown a little too comfortable, a little too presumptuous, might ask the king for a significant favour. Louis would listen patiently, his face an impassive mask, and then reply with a soft, final, "Je verrai," I will see. In the language of Versailles, this did not mean "let me think about it." It meant "no, and do not ever ask me again." It was a door quietly but firmly shut in your face, the deadbolt of royal disapproval sliding home with an audible click that only you and everyone around you could hear. Even more devastating was his famous, annihilating phrase for someone who had truly earned his ire. When that person's name was mentioned, the king would fix his gaze on the middle distance and state, flatly, "C'est un homme que je ne vois plus." That is a man I no longer see. He didn't say a man I dislike, or a man who has displeased me. He said a man he no longer sees. He was editing you out of his reality. And since his reality was the only one that mattered, you effectively ceased to exist. You were a ghost, haunting the gilded halls that were once your entire world, invisible to the only person who mattered. This slow, creeping social death was often just the prelude. If the displeasure was great enough, or the political stakes high enough, the king had a far more direct instrument at his disposal. It was perhaps the most feared object in all of France, more feared than any sword or musket. It was a simple piece of folded paper, sealed with the royal wax. It was the lettre de cachet. Literally, it means letter of the seal, which sounds rather official and harmless, but its function was anything but. The lettre de cachet was a direct order from the king, and it was the ultimate expression of absolute power. It could order anything, but it was most famous for one thing: imprisonment or exile without trial, without appeal, without any of the legal niceties we take for granted. It was a royal command that bypassed the entire legal system. You could be woken from your bed at 3 a.m. by the captain of the guard, handed this little piece of paper, and your life as you knew it was over. There was no courtroom defense. There was no jury of your peers. Your only crime was having displeased the sovereign, or perhaps having annoyed his current mistress, or having a powerful enemy at court who had successfully whispered poison into the royal ear. The letter was the sentence, the trial, and the execution all rolled into one. The guards would escort you to a waiting carriage, and you would be whisked away, often to the dreaded Bastille in Paris, or some other remote fortress prison. Now we think of the Bastille as a place of Gothic horror, of skeletons chained to damp walls, and while it could certainly be unpleasant for an aristocrat, it was often more of a psychological torment than a physical one. You might be given a reasonably comfortable room, your own furniture, even your own servant, but you were utterly alone. You were cut off from the world, from the court, from the sun. The silence you had dreaded at Versailles was now your entire reality, enshrined in stone and iron. You had all the time in the world to replay every moment, every misstep, every unfortunate turn of phrase that had led you to this stone box, wondering if you would ever see the Hall of Mirrors again. And these letters could be used for reasons that seem almost comathetic to us now. The great writer and satirist Voltaire was famously sent to the Bastille twice. The first time was for writing some witty but unflattering poems about the regent. The second time was even more absurd. After a public argument with the Chevalier de Rohan, a brutish but well-connected nobleman, Voltaire was ambushed and beaten by the Chevalier's thugs. Outraged, Voltaire sought justice. He challenged the Chevalier to a duel. The Rohan family, horrified at the idea of a mere bourgeois intellectual fighting a duel with a great noble, simply went to the king and procured a lettre de cachet. Voltaire, the victim of the assault, was the one thrown into the Bastille for having the audacity to challenge his social superior. It was a stark reminder of the rules of the game. Power, not justice, was the only thing that mattered. This ever-present threat, the king's glance, the empty antechamber, the sealed letter, created an atmosphere of intense, suffocating paranoia. Since favour was a zero-sum game, if someone else got that pension you didn't, the court was a hotbed of intrigue, gossip and espionage. Everyone was watching everyone else. Your most trusted friend might be your most dangerous rival. The friendly confidante to whom you confessed your frustrations was very likely making a mental note to discreetly pass on your words to a more powerful patron. The court was swimming with unofficial spies, known as mouchards or flies. They were everywhere. The servant who brought you your morning chocolate, the priest you confessed your sins to, the pretty young lady you flirted with at a masked ball, any of them could be reporting back on your activities, your opinions, your debts, a careless joke about the king's new building project, a sigh of frustration over the latest court fashion, a complaint about the cost of living. All of it was ammunition that could be used against you. You had to assume that every word you spoke would be recorded and filed away. It's like living your entire life on a live microphone, knowing that a panel of unseen judges is listening to your every utterance, waiting for a slip-up. This surveillance state even extended to the mail. The government maintained a secret office known as the Cabinet Noir, the Black Chamber. Here, letters were secretly opened, read, copied, and then resealed with forged seals and sent on their way. A private letter to your wife complaining that the king seemed tired and out of sorts lately could be interpreted as a slight against the monarch's vitality and land you in serious trouble. A business letter revealing the extent of your debts could be used by a rival minister to block your next appointment. There was no such thing as privacy. The walls not only had ears, they had eyes. and they took meticulous notes. To truly understand the stakes, we need only look at the foundational myth of Louis XIV's reign, the story that set the tone for all that followed. It is the tale of Nicolas Fouquet, the superintendent of finances. Fouquet was brilliant, charming, fabulously wealthy, and a great patron of the arts. He was, in many ways, everything a great nobleman should be, and that was precisely his problem. In 1661, Fouquet hosted a party at his newly completed chateau, Vaux-le-Vicomte. Now, we might have a housewarming party with some friends, and maybe a caterer. Fouquet threw a party that would make a Roman emperor blush. Vaux-le-Vicomte was, at the time, the most magnificent private residence in all of France, a masterpiece of architecture, landscape design and interior decoration, created by the dream team of Laval, Lenault, and Lebrun, the very men who would go on to define Versailles. For the party, he invited the young King Louis XIV and the entire court. The festivities were breathtaking. There was a new play by Molière, a spectacular feast served on thousands of solid gold and silver plates, and a fireworks display so elaborate it was said to turn night into day. Fouquet's intention was to flatter the king, to show him what splendor a loyal servant could create in his honor. He miscalculated, horribly. The young Louis, who was still in the process of consolidating his own power and building his own legend, did not see a tribute. He saw a rival. He walked through the gilded halls, the magnificent gardens, the opulent galleries, and he did not feel flattered. He felt upstaged. This man, his own finance minister, was living in a style that surpassed his own. The unspoken question hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Where did all this money come from? Fouquet had been skimming from the state treasury for years, a common practice at the time, but the sheer, glorious, in-your-face evidence of it was an unforgivable insult. The king's face was a mask of cold fury. His mother Anne of Austria whispered to him, "I should have him hanged." Louis was tempted to arrest Fouquet on the spot, in the middle of his own party. He was talked out of it, but the die was cast. Just 3 weeks later, the king's musketeers, led by the famous D'Artagnan, arrested Fouquet. A sham trial was held, stacked with his enemies. They wanted the death penalty. In the end, he was sentenced to banishment, but Louis, in a rare act of mercy that was actually far crueler, commuted the sentence to life imprisonment. Nicolas Fouquet, the man of exquisite taste and boundless ambition, would spend the last 20 years of his life locked away in the remote fortress of Pinerolo, a ghost erased from the world. His fate was a brutal public lesson to the entire nobility of France. There is only one sun in the sky. Do not ever, ever try to outshine it. Louis then confiscated Vaux-le-Vicomte, took Fouquet's artists and architects, and set them to work on a little hunting lodge his father had owned, a little place called Versailles. The entire project was, in its very DNA, an act of jealous one-upmanship, a declaration that no one would ever make the same mistake as Nicolas Fouquet again. The story of Fouquet is the most dramatic, but the trap of disgrace could snap shut for 100 different reasons. Take the case of the Duc de Lauzun, a man whose life story is so wildly improbable it feels like fiction. Lauzun was a favourite of Louis XIV, witty, brave, and impossibly arrogant. He flew high, so high that he managed to charm the king's own cousin, the immensely wealthy Grande Mademoiselle, into wanting to marry him. Incredibly, Louis gave his permission. Lauzun was on the verge of becoming one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, but then the court exploded in protest. The idea of a mere duke marrying a royal cousin, a granddaughter of a king of France, was too much for the other nobles to stomach. The pressure mounted, and Louis, sensing he had made a political miscalculation, rescinded his permission. Lauzun was devastated, and then he made a catastrophic error. Instead of accepting the decision with grace, he had a private, furious confrontation with the king and Madame de Montespan, the king's mistress, whom he blamed for the reversal. Accounts differ, but some say he broke his own sword over his knee in the king's presence, screaming that he would never again serve a monarch who broke his promise. You just didn't do that. You didn't scream at the sun. The result was predictable. A lettre de cachet was issued, and Lauzun was sent to the same fortress as Fouquet. He would spend 10 years in that prison. His story is a testament to the emotional volatility of the court. His spectacular rise was based on charm and royal affection. His fall was caused by a fit of pique and a wounded heart. It shows how the personal and the political were inextricably linked. Your career could be ruined, not just by treason, but by a love affair gone wrong. Even if you managed to avoid a dramatic fall like Fouquet's or Lauzun's, there was another, more insidious force constantly at work, a slow grinding pressure that could crush you just as effectively. Money, or, more accurately, the lack of it. Life at Versailles was, to put it mildly, expensive. You might think of nobles as being effortlessly wealthy, sitting on vast ancestral lands, and many were, but their expenses were astronomical. And maintaining the required lifestyle, what they called keeping their grand train, could bankrupt even the richest among them. It wasn't really a choice. It was a mandatory part of the performance. Your status was judged by visible, material things. How many servants did you have? How many horses were in your stable? Was your carriage the latest model, gilded and upholstered in the finest velvet? And the clothes? The clothes were a financial black hole. Fashion changed constantly, driven by the whims of the king and his mistresses. A new style of lace, a different cut of coat, a more elaborate wig could appear overnight, rendering your entire ruinously expensive wardrobe obsolete. To appear in last season's style was to signal that you were out of touch, or worse, out of money. It was a sign of weakness, and the court was a shark tank that smelled blood in the water. So you spent on clothes made with gold and silver thread. You spent on jewels. You spent on private dinners and entertainments to court allies. And most of all, you gambled. Card games were a nightly obsession, and the stakes were terrifyingly high. Fortunes, estates and family heirlooms could be won or lost on a single turn of a card. It was not uncommon for a duke to lose the equivalent of several $1 million in a single evening. Why did they do it? Partly for the thrill, partly to display a fashionable nonchalance about money, but mostly because the king himself enjoyed gambling. To be invited to the royal card table was a sign of favour, an opportunity you couldn't refuse. And you couldn't sit down at the king's table and bet cautiously. You had to play big. You had to be willing to lose. All of this meant that the vast majority of the court, even the grandest dukes, were living perpetually on the edge of financial ruin. They were drowning in debt, and this, from the king's perspective, was not a bug in the system. It was a feature. A nobleman deep in debt was a nobleman who was dependent. Dependent on what? On royal favour. The king was the source of all financial salvation. He could grant you a pension, a cash gift from the royal treasury. He could appoint you to a lucrative governorship, or give you a military commission. He could arrange a beneficial marriage for your son or daughter to the child of a wealthy financier. The king was the ultimate bank, the final creditor. But he didn't deal in money. He dealt in loyalty and obedience. He kept his nobility in a state of perpetual financial anxiety, forcing them to compete with one another for his life-saving handouts. It was a brilliant, cynical system of control. He had defanged them, turning them from powerful, independent feudal lords who could challenge the crown as they had done in his father's time, into gilded, bankrupt dependents, scrambling for scraps from his table. The psychological toll of this constant high-stakes game was immense. Imagine the anxiety. You're smiling and bowing, exchanging witty pleasantries in the Hall of Mirrors, all while knowing that you're one bad card game away from having to sell the forest your family has owned for 300 years. You're complimenting a rival on his new diamond-buckled shoes, while secretly praying the king grants you the pension that rival is also angling for, otherwise you won't be able to pay your tailor. It's no wonder that many courtiers suffered from what was known as maladie de la cour, or court sickness, a range of psychosomatic ailments like nervous exhaustion, digestive problems and chronic anxiety. It was the physical manifestation of living under constant, unrelenting pressure. Every day was a performance, a tightrope walk over a canyon of ruin, a misplaced word, an awkward bow, a frown from the king, a lost letter, a mounting debt. Any of these things could cause you to lose your balance and plunge into the abyss. The cruelty of the system wasn't always loud and dramatic, like the fall of Fouquet. More often, it was a quiet, grinding, soul-destroying process. It was the slow erosion of your fortune, the constant fear of being watched, the daily humiliation of having to flatter and beg, the gnawing uncertainty of your position. They were trapped in a beautiful cage, and the bars were made of etiquette, debt, and the desperate need for a single man's approval. They had traded real power for the illusion of it, autonomy for proximity. They were fighting not for land or armies, but for the right to hold the king's shirt, for a nod in a crowded room, for a quiet word that meant they would survive another day. The theatre was magnificent, the costumes were sublime, but the play was a tragedy, and its title was whispered in the silent, empty antechambers of the disgraced oblivion. The greatest performance was simply staying on the stage, knowing that the silence waiting in the wings was absolute. Chapter 4. Gardens, Gowns, and Gambits. The parallel worlds of the court. But that stage, the one centred on the king's bedchamber and the Hall of Mirrors, was not the only one at Versailles. It was merely the main stage, the one illuminated by the brightest, most unforgiving lights. To truly understand the life of this strange, glittering ecosystem, we have to imagine the palace not as a single theatre, but as a sprawling complex of them, each with its own cast, its own script, and its own silent, ever-present threat of oblivion waiting in the wings. While the men vied for the king's shirt, a parallel universe of immense power, governed by its own ferocious logic, operated just inches away, in the rustle of a silk skirt, the flick of a fan, and the tilt of a powdered head. This was the world of the women of Versailles. Here the hierarchy was just as rigid, but infinitely more subtle. At its apex sat two suns, often in opposition, creating a delicate and dangerous gravitational pull that warped the entire court around them. First there was the queen, the legitimate, sacred, unimpeachable centre of the female court. Her position was guaranteed by God and treaty. She was the mother of the heir, the symbol of dynastic stability, and yet so often she was a satellite in her own solar system. Think of Marie Thérèse, Louis XIV's Spanish wife. Pious, quiet, and largely ignored, she drifted through the palace like a ghost in priceless jewels, her primary political function having been completed the moment she produced a son. Her power was immense in theory, but in practice, it was passive. It was the power of position, not of person. And then there was the other sun, the one that often burned brighter, hotter, and with more terrifying energy, the maîtresse en titre, the official royal mistress. This wasn't some sordid, hidden affair. This was a formal, recognized position at court, a role of unbelievable influence. The official mistress had her own apartments, her own staff, and most importantly, she had the king's ear, his time, and his affection. While the queen represented the state, the mistress often represented the king's actual heart, and with it his will. This created a dynamic that was nothing short of electric. The court was forced to split its loyalties, to perform a constant, nerve-wracking ballet of allegiances. To be seen favouring the queen too, openly could be seen as a slight to the king's chosen companion, but to fawn over the mistress was to insult the consecrated Queen of France, so you learnt to walk a tightrope over a canyon of social ruin. You bowed to the queen with the perfect degree of formal reverence. Then you would turn to the mistress, say the brilliant and formidable Madame de Montespan, and offer a greeting that was warmer, more intimate, a clear acknowledgement of her real power. Every greeting was a calculation, every invitation was a political statement. The apartments of the queen and the mistress were the epicenters of two competing courts. Ambitious families would try to place their daughters in the household of one or the other, a strategic investment in a future of favour. If you wanted a military commission for your son, you didn't just petition the Minister of War. You might first petition a lady-in-waiting to the Queen, who might mention it to Her Majesty, who might, on a good day, mention it to the King. Or, for a much faster result, you'd find a way to get your request to the mistress, who could whisper it to the King, that very evening over cards. Which path did you choose? It was a gamble, and a wrong bet could see your family sidelined for a generation. The rivalry wasn't always subtle. Madame de Montespan, at the height of her power with Louis XIV, lived in a splendour that often eclipsed the Queen's. Her apartments were larger, her gowns more magnificent, her influence over art and architecture undeniable. She was a second queen in all but name, and the court knew it. They flocked to her, because she was the source of the warmth they all craved, royal favour. Then, years later, you see the rise of Madame de Pompadour under Louis XV. She was not just a mistress, she was an unelected prime minister, a minister of culture, a political force who could make or break careers with a single well-placed comment. She wasn't just influencing the king, she was, in many ways, helping him govern. Imagine the resentment this bred in the old nobility, who saw this woman, a commoner by birth, wielding more power than dukes whose lineage stretched back to the Crusades. They smiled at her, of course. They attended her parties and praised her impeccable taste. But behind their fans, the whispers were venomous. The Queen, for her part, had to endure this with a kind of superhuman grace. Her victory was in her dignity, in her unassailable position as the legitimate wife and mother. She could not be dismissed. A mistress, no matter how powerful, served at the king's pleasure. Her fall from grace could be swift and total, a sudden plunge from the centre of the universe to a forgotten convent in the countryside. The Queen's position was for life, and so she played the long game, a quiet, enduring presence, a symbol of stability in a world of frantic, fleeting power. It was a silent, bitter war, fought not with armies, but with etiquette, precedence and patronage. And how did these women, and the courtiers who orbited them, signal their allegiances in this silent war? They wore them, literally. Fashion at Versailles wasn't about looking good. That was a pleasant but secondary concern. Fashion was a language, a weapon, and a political manifesto, all stitched into one impossibly expensive garment. Your choice of dress was your daily statement of wealth, status, taste, and most importantly, loyalty. Let's begin with the sheer architecture of the clothing. For women, the defining feature for much of the 18th century was the pannier, those enormous wicker or whalebone cages worn under the skirt, which could extend several feet on either side. Forget walking through a door forwards. You had to learn to navigate the world sideways like a very elegant crab. These weren't just a fashion choice. They were a deliberate occupation of space. A woman with wide panniers was a walking declaration of her own importance, physically demanding that others make way. It was social distancing, centuries before its time, but for the purpose of projecting status, not health. Then you would add the dress itself, which could be made of dozens of yards of lion silk or velvet, embroidered with gold and silver thread, and adorned with a king's ransom in lace, ribbons and artificial flowers. The cost was astronomical. A single court gown could cost more than a common labourer would earn in a lifetime. This wasn't just extravagance for its own sake. It was a form of economic warfare. The unspoken rule, set by the king and his circle, was that one must never wear the same gown to a major court event twice. The sheer financial pressure this created was immense. It was a way of weeding out the less wealthy nobility. If you couldn't keep up with the endless demand for new, ever more elaborate clothing, you would be forced to retreat from court, your influence fading as your finances dwindled. It was a kind of sartorial arms race, and the styles changed with bewildering speed, a sort of 18th century fast fashion driven by the whims of the inner circle. One week, a certain shade of yellow, named caca dauphin, with a straight face after the contents of the royal baby's diaper, might be the absolute pinnacle of style. To appear in it was to show you were in the know. The next week, it was hopelessly passé, and anyone wearing it was marked as a provincial outsider. It was a constant, terrifying exam of your social relevance, and the subject was fabric. Men were not immune. Their outfits were just as peacockish and laden with meaning. They wore brightly coloured silk coats, waistcoats intricately embroidered with botanical or pastoral scenes, and breeches that terminated in silk stockings. The quality of a man's lace at his cuffs and throat was a direct indicator of his wealth. The sparkle of the diamond buckles on his shoes, the tilt of his powdered wig, the casual, expert way he handled his ceremonial sword. It was all part of the performance. A frayed cuff, or a slightly out-of-date waistcoat, could be a sign that a man's fortunes were on the wane, and the social sharks of the court would begin to circle. Perhaps nothing captures the beautiful absurdity of Versailles fashion more than the hairstyles. In the later reign of Louis XV, and into the time of Marie Antoinette, women's hair became a literal canvas for self-expression and political commentary. The pouf was born. Hair was augmented with horsehair pads and wire frames, built up to astonishing heights of 2 or 3 feet, and then powdered grey or white with flour. But it didn't stop there. These towers of hair were then decorated with elaborate scenes. A woman might wear a model of a ship in her hair to celebrate a naval victory, the famous pouf à la belle poule. Another might construct a pastoral fantasy with miniature sheep, windmills and shepherds. One famous creation, the pouf à sentiment, incorporated likenesses of one's loved ones, perhaps a lock of a child's hair or a miniature portrait of a pet. Imagine the sheer impracticality. These creations took hours to build and were often left in place for days or even weeks, leading to, shall we say, less than fresh results. Ladies had to sleep sitting up, their precious coiffures resting on special pillows. They couldn't fit into sedan chairs or carriages without crouching or tilting their heads at impossible angles. And the constant powdering with flour during a time of bread shortages for the general populace was, well, let's politely call it a public relations misstep. It was a perfect symbol of Versailles itself, a beautiful, elaborate and utterly nonsensical bubble, completely detached from the reality of the world outside. Every glance in a mirror was a reminder that you were part of this exclusive, artificial world. Every gown, every wig, every diamond buckle was a piece of your uniform in the unending campaign for status. So you have the players, and you have their costumes. Now, where do they perform? The daily rituals of the king's life were one stage, but the evenings brought forth entirely new arenas for intrigue. The balls, the operas, and the gambling tables. These were not moments of relaxation. They were simply a continuation of the day's battles, but under the flattering, deceptive glow of a few thousand candles. Let's step into a ball in the Hall of Mirrors. First, the sensory overload. The light from 10,000 candles is reflected infinitely in the mirrors, creating a dazzling, almost blinding universe of light. The heat is immense. The air is thick with the scent of perfume, sweat, melting wax, and the pomade used on hundreds of wigs. The sound is a symphony of orchestral music, the rustle of 1,000 silk gowns, and a constant low hum of whispers and gossip. It is beautiful, and it is suffocating. To be invited to these balls was a privilege. To be asked to dance by a member of the royal family was the goal. The dances themselves were highly choreographed and complex. A minuet wasn't just a dance, it was a public audition of your grace, your poise, and your knowledge of courtly subtleties. A single misstep, a clumsy turn, a moment of forgotten choreography, and you would become the subject of ridicule for weeks. You were performing not just for a partner, but for the entire court. The king himself would often watch, his discerning eye missing nothing. A graceful performance could catch his attention, a poor one could mark you as unrefined. This was where proximity was everything. Your goal was to be seen by the right people, to exchange a meaningful glance with a powerful minister, to share a whispered joke with the king's brother. The ball was a fluid, shifting map of power. You could watch the tides of favour rise and fall in real time. Who was standing near the king tonight? Whose hand did the queen take for the opening dance? Which young lady was the dauphin paying particular attention to? It was the 18th century equivalent of obsessively checking a live social media feed, but the stakes were your family's entire future. Then there was the opera and the theatre. Louis XIV, in particular, understood the power of spectacle. The productions at Versailles were the most lavish in Europe. Jean-Baptiste Lully composed operas that were essentially propaganda set to music, full of allegorical tales about heroic, sun-like kings who brought order and glory to the world. No one was confused about who that was supposed to represent. To attend the opera was to participate in this ritual of king worship, but it was also another opportunity for social manoeuvring. The seating was of course arranged by rank. Your box's location was a public declaration of your status. During the performance, as much attention was paid to the audience as to the stage. Who was visiting whose box during the intermission? Who was seen whispering behind a fan while the soprano hit a high C? The real drama was often not on the stage, but in the seats. After the formal entertainments, when the public-facing performance of the day was done, a different kind of performance began, one that was in some ways more honest and more brutal. Gambling. The court of Versailles was consumed by it. It was a polite but desperate antidote to the crushing, gilded boredom of a life with no real purpose beyond proximity to the king. Games of chance like lansquenet, hocke and faro were played for stakes that are staggering to the modern mind. Imagine a room, blue with the smoke from candles, silent except for the soft riffle of cards and the clink of gold coins. The louis d'or. Here, a duke might lose an entire estate in a single night. A marquise might gamble away her daughter's dowry on the turn of a card. These were not friendly weekly poker games. This was a high-stakes, high-risk world where fortunes were made and more often destroyed. Louis XIV himself didn't gamble much, but he understood its utility. It kept his nobles occupied, and crucially, it kept them in debt. A noble in debt was a noble dependent on the king's generosity for a pension, a sinecure, a well-paid but meaningless governorship. It was another invisible leash, another way of ensuring loyalty. The gambling table was the great equalizer and the great revealer of character. Rank meant little when the cards were dealt. It was a pure meritocracy of luck, but the true test was not in winning or losing, but in how you lost. The ultimate sign of good breeding, of aristocratic cool, was to lose a fortune without any visible change in expression, to watch your family's ancestral lands vanish with a shrug and a slight wry smile that was the pinnacle of style, to show distress, to argue with the dealer, to betray any sign of the financial ruin that was consuming you, was to commit social suicide. It was a sign that you cared about something as vulgar as money. The performance of nonchalance was the only thing that mattered. Many nobles were bankrupted. They would sell their lands, their townhouses in Paris, their family silver, all to maintain the illusion of infinite wealth required to stay at court. They were trapped. To leave Versailles was to cease to exist in the world that mattered, but to stay was to spiral deeper and deeper into a bottomless pit of debt. The quiet desperation in these candlelit card rooms must have been immense, a frantic, smiling terror hidden behind a veneer of bored amusement. And when the gilded cage of the palace itself, with its endless ceremonies and its stifling perfumed air, became too much, there was one final stage on which to perform: the gardens. But if you're picturing a gentle, rambling English park, a place to relax and enjoy nature, you couldn't be more wrong. The gardens of Versailles were not an escape from the palace. They were an extension of its philosophy. They were nature, but nature that had been beaten into submission. Designed by the genius André Lenotte, the gardens are a masterpiece of formal, geometric design. They are an architectural space, built not from stone but from foliage, water and earth. Standing on the palace terrace and looking out, you see the core principle of Versailles laid bare. Absolute control. The lawns are perfect rectangles. The trees are planted in rigid lines, their branches clipped into neat, identical shapes. The paths run in long, straight axes, creating incredible vistas that seem to stretch to infinity, drawing the eye and the mind towards the horizon, a symbol of the king's limitless power. There is nothing wild here. Nothing is left to chance. Every fountain, every statue, every flower bed is a testament to man's, and specifically the king's, dominion over the natural world. And this vast outdoor palace served many purposes. It was, of course, a place for the promenade. In the late afternoon, the court would stroll along the Grand Canal or through the main alleys. This was the daily catwalk, a chance to display your new outfit, to be seen with the right people, to catch a moment of the king's time as he took his own walk. It was the same game as inside, just with more sky and the crunch of gravel underfoot. But the gardens also held a secret. Woven into the grand formal layout was a network of smaller hidden groves or bosquets. These were like secret outdoor rooms, enclosed by high, clipped hedges, and often containing their own surprise: a spectacular fountain, an open-air ballroom, a grotto of shells. Here, away from the prying eyes of the main promenades, a different kind of life could unfold. This was where you could have a truly private conversation, where political plots could be hatched, and where forbidden romances could blossom. The bosquets offered the illusion of privacy, a precious commodity in a palace where every wall had ears. To be invited by a powerful figure for a stroll in a particular bosquet was a sign of great favour, an entry into an inner circle of confidence. The gardens were also the setting for the most spectacular events of all, the fêtes. These were multi-day festivals of unbelievable extravagance. For the pleasures of the Enchanted Isle, in 1664, Louis XIV transformed the gardens into a mythical realm for 3 days of ballets, mock battles and feasts. A floating palace for the sorceress Alcina was built on the Grand Canal, which was then theatrically destroyed with spectacular fireworks. For another fête, the entire fleet of Venetian gondolas, a gift to the king, was used for a mock naval battle on the canal. Temporary theatres and ballrooms were erected, lit by thousands of lanterns hung from the trees. These events were, again, a form of propaganda. They were designed to awe and overwhelm the senses, to create a living myth of the king as a kind of god on earth, an Apollo or a Jupiter who could command not just men, but the very elements to create paradise. They bankrupted the treasury, but they cemented the image of the Sun King in the minds of his nobles and the ambassadors of Europe. To participate in one of these fetes was to feel for a moment that you were living not in France but in a waking dream, a magical world conjured by the will of a single man. Yet, even in this manicured paradise, reality had a way of creeping in. The gardens were enormous, and keeping them pristine required an army of gardeners. The thousands of fountains, a wonder of hydraulic engineering for their time, could not all be run at once. There wasn't enough water pressure, so a system of whistle boys was employed. These were young boys stationed throughout the gardens, and when they saw the king and his entourage approaching a certain area, they would whistle to the fountain operators, who would quickly turn on the valves for that section. The moment the king passed, the water would be shut off to conserve it for the next fountain on his route. It was a perfect metaphor for Versailles itself, a magnificent illusion, maintained by frantic, hidden effort, all choreographed around the movements of one man. As the sun would set over the Grand Canal, casting long shadows down the perfect manicured lawns, the court would retreat back into the palace for the evening's entertainments, but the feeling of the gardens would linger, that sense of vastness, of order imposed on chaos. It was another reminder that at Versailles, every single aspect of existence, from the way you held your fork to the shape of the trees, was part of the same unending performance. Whether you were navigating the treacherous currents of the women's court, weaponizing the lace on your cuffs, losing a fortune with a bored smile, or meeting for a secret conversation in a hidden grove, you were on stage. You were playing a part in the grand, beautiful, and utterly brutal theatre of power, a world where the gardens were as political as the staterooms, and a gown could be as deadly as a dagger. It was a life of constant performance, where the only prize was to be allowed to perform again tomorrow, and the only real terror was the thought of the curtain finally coming down. Chapter 5. Echoes of Absolutism, the Versailles Model, and the Courts of Europe. And when that curtain came down on the French stage, the strange thing was, it didn't really end the show, because by then, every other monarch in Europe had a copy of the script. They'd been sitting in the audience, taking notes, mesmerized by the sheer spectacle of it all. Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a product. It was the most successful, most influential, and most impossibly expensive brand of the 17th and 18th centuries. And everyone, it seemed, wanted to open their own franchise. The idea of absolute power, packaged and presented with such flawless, glittering choreography, was simply too tempting to ignore. So the great theatre of Versailles went on tour. In a way, the sets were changed, the language was different, but the play remained fundamentally the same. It was a continent-wide performance, with each monarch trying to outdo the Sun King, or at the very least, prove that they too knew how to command a stage. So let us drift away from the manicured lawns of France, and let our journey take us south, across the Pyrenees, into the stark, sun-beaten heart of Spain. Here, the air feels different, the light is sharper, the shadows deeper, and the court, well, the Spanish court looked at Versailles, and gave a slow, deliberate, almost imperceptible shake of the head, not in disapproval precisely, more in the way a master craftsman looks at a flashy new invention and thinks, amusing, but we have our own way of doing things, an older way. The Spanish court, centred in the imposing granite fortress palace of the Escorial, did not dance to the French tune. They moved to a much older, slower, more sombre rhythm. This was the home of the Spanish Habsburgs, a dynasty so steeped in tradition and piety that they made Louis XIV look like a freewheeling revolutionary. The guiding principle here wasn't éclatant, that brilliant French flash of glory. The guiding principle was gravity, gravedad, a profound, unshakable seriousness that permeated everything, from the way a fork was held to the way a king was born and died. Their rulebook wasn't a new invention. It was the ancient and incredibly rigid Burgundian ceremonial, a set of protocols inherited from their ancestors, the Dukes of Burgundy, centuries before. Think of it as the original software for running a monarchy, passed down through generations. While Versailles was running on the latest, most dazzling operating system, the Spanish court was still using a system that was ancient, incredibly complex, and utterly unforgiving. There were no optional updates. You either followed the protocol to the letter, or the entire system crashed. The Escorial itself tells you everything you need to know. It's not a pleasure palace. It's a grid of grey stone, half monastery, half mausoleum, half royal residence. It squats in the mountains outside Madrid, like a giant brooding beast of piety. The wind that whistles through its endless corridors doesn't carry the scent of perfume and roasting meats. It carries the chill of stone and the faint, lingering smell of incense. The dominant sound isn't the rustle of silk and whispered gossip, but the echo of a solitary footstep and the distant chanting of monks. This was a court where God was not just an honoured guest. He was the senior management, and the king was his chief earthly administrator. Life within these walls was a masterpiece of restrictive choreography. At Versailles, proximity to the king was a frantic, competitive scramble. In Spain, it was a fixed, almost cosmic law. Your place was determined by a web of lineage, so tangled that it would make a modern genealogist weep. You didn't earn a spot, you were born into it, and you would die in it. The King of Spain was not a performer in the same way Louis was. He was an icon, a living relic. He didn't need to prove his power through accessibility. He proved it through his almost total inaccessibility. He was encased in layers of etiquette so thick that he was barely a person anymore. He was a function, a sacrament. There's a famous, if possibly embellished, story that perfectly captures this world. A Spanish queen was once thrown from her horse, her foot caught in the stirrup. As the horse bolted, dragging her along, 2 courtiers rushed forward and saved her life. Their reward? They were immediately forced to flee the country. Their crime? They had committed the unforgivable sin of touching the queen. The protocol was absolute. The person of the monarch was sacred, untouchable. To lay a hand on her, even to save her life, was a violation of this sacred law. You can just imagine them, riding for the border, trying to explain to the guards why they were in such a hurry. Yes, we just rescued the Queen of Spain from certain death. As a result, we will be executed if we're not in Portugal by dawn. It's complicated. Compared to this, the crush of the lever at Versailles seems almost casual. In Spain, the king's daily routine was a religious rite. He ate alone, in public. A spectacle of silent, solitary consumption. Dozens of nobles would stand in breathless silence, simply watching the king chew. Their entire day, their entire purpose, was to be a silent audience to the king's digestion. If you think your job has moments of pointless tedium, spare a thought for the duke, whose sole function for 3 hours was to stand perfectly still and watch another man eat soup. And the dress code? Oh, the dress code. The Spanish court clung to the stiff, dark, formal attire of the previous century. While the French were flouncing in silks, lace and pastel colours, the Spanish nobles were encased in black velvet. The wide, cumbersome farthingale, a sort of rigid bell-shaped underskirt, was still in fashion for women long after it had been abandoned everywhere else. It made movement difficult, and sitting a complex architectural problem. Men wore the golilla, a severe, flat white collar that held the head in a stiff, upright position, making it physically impossible to look relaxed. Spanish fashion was not about comfort or even beauty in the French sense. It was about projecting austerity, piety, and an unshakable, unbending dignity. It was armour for the soul, so while a French duke might ruin himself buying the latest diamond buttons to catch the king's eye, a Spanish grandee's status was displayed by the sheer, perfect blackness of his doublet and the rigid, pious set of his jaw. It was a different kind of competition, not a race for attention, but a contest of who could best embody the court's soul-crushing solemnity, who could stand the longest without fidgeting, who could maintain a look of profound seriousness while discussing the weather. These were the skills that mattered at the Escorial. It's a fascinating contrast. Versailles was a system of power built on movement, on spectacle, on the constant churning sea of humanity around a central sun. The Spanish court was a system of power built on stillness, on distance, on the fixed and unmoving constellations of an ancient sky. It was a silent, powerful rejection of the Versailles model, a quiet insistence that true power didn't need to shout, or dance, or even smile. It simply was. It existed, immovable and eternal, like the granite blocks of the palace itself. But not everyone had Spain's deep-rooted confidence in its own traditions. As we drift eastward, across the Alps and into the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, we find a very different story. Here, in the fragmented lands of the German states, Versailles wasn't something to be ignored, it was something to be copied, desperately. Imagine the Holy Roman Empire at this time, not as a single country, but as a sprawling, chaotic neighbourhood of hundreds of tiny houses, grand estates, and a few impressive mansions, all existing in a state of perpetual low-grade rivalry. And then, down the street, Louis XIV builds Versailles, a structure so vast, so opulent, so blindingly brilliant that it casts a shadow over everyone else. Suddenly, your perfectly respectable palace looks a bit shabby. Your court ceremonies feel provincial. Your title of elector, or duke, or landgrave sounds a little less impressive. The pressure to keep up with the Bourbons was immense. What followed was a sort of architectural and cultural arms race. Dozens of German princes, electors, and even bishops began a frantic campaign of palace building. They may not have had the resources of the King of France, but by heaven they were going to try. This is the era of the Versailles in miniature. All across the German-speaking lands, little copies began to sprout up, each one a testament to the ego and ambition of its owner. Let's glide over to Vienna, the capital of the Austrian Habsburgs. They were in a slightly awkward position. As Holy Roman Emperors, they were the most prestigious rulers in the German lands, and as cousins to the Spanish kings, they shared that taste for gravity and protocol. But Vienna was also a crossroads, a place where Italian Baroque flair and Eastern European influences met Germanic tradition. Their court at the Hofburg Palace, and later at the magnificent Schönbrunn, was a hybrid. It tried to blend the solemnity of Spain with some of the fashionable glitter of France. Schönbrunn Palace, Maria Theresa's summer residence, is a perfect example. On the outside, with its symmetrical facade and sprawling gardens, it's a clear nod to Versailles. It says, "We too understand grandeur." But inside, the feeling is different. The famous yellow paint gives it a warmth and lightness that the French palace lacks. The ceremonies were grand, to be sure, but they often had a slightly more gemütlich, a more cosy and familial undertone, especially under Maria Theresa, who ruled not as a distant son but as the matriarch of her empire and her 16 children. There was still protocol, mountains of it, but it was Austrian protocol, which meant it was somehow both incredibly formal and yet slightly less intense than its French or Spanish counterparts. They managed to import the aesthetics of Versailles without necessarily importing all of its soul-crushing paranoia. But it was in the smaller states that the Versailles obsession reached its peak, sometimes bordering on the comical. Take Karl Eugen, Duke of Württemberg. He poured a simply ruinous amount of money into building Ludwigsburg Palace, a sprawling Baroque masterpiece, sometimes called the Versailles of Swabia. He imported French architects, French dancers, French chefs, and of course the French language, which became the mandatory tongue of his court. He staged elaborate operas and ballets, held hunts on a scale that aped Louis XIV's, and enforced an etiquette that was a detailed replica of the French system. The only problem was, he was the Duke of Württemberg, not the King of France. His resources were finite. His attempts to fund this lifestyle through crushing taxes on his subjects led to constant conflict and unrest. You can picture a peasant farmer, handing over his last coins, being told it was for a new shipment of ostrich plumes for a court masque he would never see. The Duke was living a fantasy, playing the role of the Sun King on a stage his duchy simply couldn't afford. And he wasn't alone. From Munich to Dresden to Potsdam, rulers were bankrupting their states to build their own slice of French-style heaven, complete with Hall of Mirrors knockoffs and gardens designed by students of Le Notre. It was a strange phenomenon, a German prince, speaking French to his German courtiers, in a German palace designed to look like a French one. The entire culture of the elite was an imported product. It created a vast, almost unbridgeable gulf between the rulers and the ruled. The prince and his nobles were living in a bubble of French culture, while the people outside the palace gates spoke German, lived German lives, and paid for the whole expensive illusion. Let's drift north, to Prussia. Here, things get a little different again. Frederick the Great, in his jewel-box palace of Sanssouci near Potsdam, offers another fascinating variation. Sanssouci means without a care, and the name itself is a statement. It was his escape from the rigid formalities of the main Berlin court. It's small, elegant, and intimate. Yes, it's French in its Rococo style, and Frederick spoke and wrote almost exclusively in French. He famously corresponded with Voltaire, the great French philosopher. But his court at Sanssouci was not a hub of political maneuvering like Versailles. It was a retreat for music, philosophy, and conversation with a small, hand-picked circle of male friends. Frederick was a flute player and composer. His evenings were spent not in grand balls but in concerts where he himself would perform. He was an absolute monarch and a ruthless military commander, but his ideal court was a philosophical salon, not a theatre of power. He took the cultural and aesthetic elements of the French model, the art, the music, the language, the intellectualism, but he largely rejected the soul-sucking etiquette and the endless public performance that came with it. He curated his own, more personal, more intellectual version of the good life. He wanted the French brain, but not necessarily the French wig. Sanssouci is what you get when a philosopher king tries to build his own little Versailles, but decides to leave out all the boring parts with the bowing and scraping. This frantic imitation, this continent-wide game of anything you can do I can do smaller and with more debt, shows just how powerful the Versailles model was. It wasn't just about politics, it was about culture. It defined what it meant to be a king, what it meant to be a noble, what it meant to be civilized for the better part of a century. To reject it, like the Spanish, required an immense sense of your own historical importance. For most, the only option was to emulate, adapt, and pretend. But now, our journey must take a final dramatic turn, leaving the fractured heart of Europe behind and sweeping eastward, across the vast plains, to a land that was, to the courts of France and Germany, a place of myth and mystery, Russia. Russia in the late 17th century was seen by the rest of Europe as a colossus, but a backward one. It was a world of Byzantine ritual, long beards and heavy brocaded robes. Its court in the Moscow Kremlin was governed by ancient semi-Asiatic traditions that had no connection to the polished choreography of the West. And then, a human earthquake came to the throne, a man nearly 7 feet tall, with a ferocious energy and an insatiable, almost terrifying curiosity, Peter the Great. Peter didn't just want to copy the West. He wanted to drag his entire country kicking and screaming into the modern European world, and to do that, he knew he needed a new court, a new capital, and a new kind of Russian nobleman. During his grand embassy, a sort of extended fact-finding mission / incognito royal tour of Europe, he saw the palaces and shipyards of the West. He was more impressed by the Dutch shipbuilders and the English engineers than the fops at court, but he understood the power of spectacle. He visited Versailles, and while he found the etiquette tedious, the scale of it, the sheer statement of power, made a deep impression. He knew he needed one of his own. So on a marshy, mosquito-infested swamp on the Baltic coast, he built his new capital, St. Petersburg, his window on the west. And on the Gulf of Finland, he commanded the creation of his own Versailles Peterhof. Peterhof is a staggering creation, a grand cascade of fountains, more extensive and powerful than the one at Versailles, tumbles down a hillside from the palace to the sea. The entire design is a direct, almost challenging response to Louis XIV. The message was clear: you have a palace of power on the land, I have one that commands the sea. Anything you can do, I, the Tsar of all the Russias, can do bigger and with more water pressure. But Peterhof also reflects Peter's unique and, frankly, rather brutal personality. Versailles' gardens are about control, order, and elegant promenades. Peterhof's gardens are also about that, but they're also about practical jokes. Peter, who had a rather boisterous and cruel sense of humour, had his engineers design trick fountains. A visitor might be strolling down a path, or sitting on an inviting bench, when suddenly a hidden courtier would turn a valve, and jets of water would shoot up from the ground, drenching the unsuspecting noble. The Tsar would roar with laughter as his courtiers, dressed in their finest imported silks, were soaked to the skin. Can you imagine that happening at Versailles? A duke being spontaneously drenched on the orders of a giggling Louis XIV? It's unthinkable. It violates the very soul of French etiquette, which was all about maintaining one's composure and dignity. But in Russia, it was a reminder of who was in charge. It was absolutism with a slapstick, menacing edge. You are here at the Tsar's pleasure, and his pleasure might just involve giving you an impromptu shower. It was a way of enforcing a new kind of etiquette, one based not on ancient lineage, but on absolute, unpredictable, and personal imperial power. Peter's court was a bizarre and often terrifying mix of imported European polish and raw, traditional Russian force. He famously ordered his nobles, the boyars, to shave their long, cherished beards, a symbol of their old status and piety. He held a razor himself at a party, and personally sheared them off, a moment of profound cultural violation disguised as a courtly gathering. He replaced their long robes with European-style coats and breeches. He commanded that they hold assemblies, parties where men and women were supposed to mingle and dance in the Western style, something utterly alien to Muscovite tradition. These assemblies were often brutally awkward. A decree had to be issued telling the nobles not to get blind drunk before 9 o'clock at night. Another rule had to specify that ladies should be allowed to participate in the conversation. Peter was trying to force a century of social change in a single generation, often through sheer intimidation. His court was less a delicate dance and more a compulsory, and often clumsy, training camp for a new kind of Russian. It was Versailles as imagined by a drill sergeant. Later, under empresses like Catherine the Great, the Russian court would become one of the most magnificent and genuinely Francophile in all of Europe. Catherine corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot. She collected French art, and the Russian aristocracy spoke French as their first language, often better than they spoke Russian. The court at the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg became a glittering hub of Enlightenment culture, a true rival to Versailles in its splendor and sophistication. But it was always built on the violent, swampy foundations that Peter had laid. The polish was immaculate, but underneath it was the memory of a power that was absolute in a way that Louis XIV, constrained by his own web of tradition and law, could only dream of. The Russian version of absolutism always had a sharper, more dangerous edge. The curtain could come down on you not just socially, but literally, with a one-way trip to the frozen wastes of Siberia. And so, as we drift through these echoing halls of power, the solemn stone of the Escorial, the sun-yellow warmth of Schönbrunn, the charming pretense of a minor German court, the waterlogged grandeur of Peterhof, we see that Versailles was more than a building. It was a catalyst. It was an idea that forced every ruler in Europe to ask themselves a question: who are we, and how do we wish to perform our power? Some, like the Spanish, clung to their own older answers. Others copied the French script word for word, often with disastrous financial results. And some, like Peter, took the script, rewrote it with a brutal local accent, and created something entirely new and entirely their own. Each palace is a reflection of a different national character, a different monarch's ego, but they are all united by that shared language of absolutism, that belief that a king is the center of the universe, and that the world should be organized as neatly as a garden around his person. The sheer, back-breaking, mind-numbing effort that went into maintaining these systems is staggering. The lives consumed by the endless ritual, the fortunes spent on a single night's entertainment, the minds narrowed by the constant focus on rank and precedence. It was a world built on a foundation of absolute control, decorated with the finest art and music the world had to offer. A gilded cage, to be sure, but a cage on a scale the world had never seen before, and would never see again. And from the quiet stillness of Spain to the forced revelry of Russia, the unblinking eye of protocol watched over them all, ensuring every player knew their lines and no one ever dared to miss their cue. Chapter 6. The Gilded Cage Rusts. From apathy to revolution, and from the quiet stillness of Spain to the forced revelry of Russia, the unblinking eye of protocol watched over them all, ensuring every player knew their lines and no one ever dared to miss their cue. But a play, no matter how grand, is only as strong as its lead actors. A system built on the singular solar force of one man's will is a fragile thing indeed. It assumes that every successor will have the same energy, the same dedication, the same almost superhuman ability to live one's entire life as a public spectacle. It assumes the sun will always want to be the sun. The problem is that cages, even gilded ones, eventually start to rust, the bars grow thin, and the performance, repeated day after day, year after year, can become, well, tedious. The unblinking eye of protocol begins to feel less like a tool of power, and more like a tiresome chore. And what happens when the players, the ones born into the lead roles, decide they'd rather not be in the play at all? What happens when the person at the center of the universe just wants a little peace and quiet? When Louis XIV finally departed the world in 1715, leaving behind a France that was both the cultural pinnacle of Europe and teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, he left an impossible shadow. His successor, his great-grandson Louis XV, was just a small boy. The court, for a time, moved back to Paris during a regency, and for a few years it seemed the spell of Versailles might be broken. The air in the palace grew still. The gilding gathered a fine layer of dust, but the machine was too large, too established to be abandoned. Eventually the court returned, the palace was reawakened, and the young Louis XV was plugged into the system, expected to become the new sun around which everything would orbit. But Louis XV was not his great-grandfather, where the Sun King was theatrical, disciplined, and seemed to genuinely thrive on public display. Louis XV was shy. He was intelligent, handsome, and by all accounts capable, but he was also prone to melancholy, an almost crippling ennui. He understood the duties of the public monarch, and he performed them. He got up in the morning for the lever, he ate his meals in public for the grand couvert, he went to bed at night with the court. He said the lines, he hit the marks, but the fire wasn't there. You could see it in his eyes. For Louis XIV, the ceremony was the power. For Louis XV, the ceremony was the price of power. It was the long, boring meeting you have to sit through before you can go home. And so, he began to look for a way to go home, without ever leaving the palace. This is where the great, grand public machine of Versailles begins to develop a critical fault line. Louis XV began to create a world within a world. He commissioned the construction of the Petits Appartements du Roi, the king's private apartments. Now this sounds perfectly reasonable to us. Of course you'd want a private living room, a place to unwind away from the office. But at Versailles this was a revolutionary act. The king wasn't supposed to have a private life. His life was the state. His bedroom wasn't a bedroom, it was a stage. These new apartments were a direct contradiction to everything Versailles stood for. They were located right behind the grand, formal staterooms, a secret, more comfortable world accessible through hidden doors. Gone were the vast, echoing spaces and throne-like furniture. Here the rooms were smaller, the ceilings lower. The furniture was comfortable, elegant, designed for conversation, not for audiences. There were small dining rooms, cozy sitting rooms, even a private kitchen where the king, the absolute monarch of France, enjoyed making hot chocolate and coffee for his closest friends. Imagine the cognitive dissonance. Out in the Hall of Mirrors, thousands of nobles are jostling for position, their entire lives dedicated to catching a single glance from the king as he walks from one ceremony to another. And just a few feet away, through a panelled wall, that very same king is quietly trying to perfect his recipe for scrambled eggs with a few intimate companions. This creation of a private sphere had a profound and corrosive effect on the court. The whole currency of Versailles was proximity to the monarch. Your rank was determined by who you were allowed to speak to, who you could hand a shirt to, who you could watch eat a boiled chicken. But if the king increasingly preferred to spend his evenings in his private apartments with a handful of chosen friends, what was the point of it all? The public ceremonies, the lever and the coucher continued, but they started to feel hollow. They became the public-facing part of the job, the ceremonial ribbon-cutting, while the real business, the real influence was happening behind closed doors. The nobility was still trapped. They had to be at Versailles. Their entire social and financial existence depended on it. But now they were trapped in the grand, drafty lobby of a building where the real party was happening in a locked room upstairs. A deep systemic boredom began to set in. The court, which had been the vibrant if ruthless political heart of France, slowly began to stagnate. It became a waiting room, and into this vacuum of influence stepped a new kind of power player, one for whom the old rules of noble bloodlines meant very little. If access to the king's private life was the new currency, then the person who could master that world would hold the real power. Enter Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, better known to history as the Marquise de Pompadour. She was not of the high nobility. She was a member of the wealthy bourgeoisie, exceptionally intelligent, charming and beautiful. She became Louis XV's official chief mistress in 1745, but she was so much more than that. She was his best friend, his confidante, his political advisor, and in many ways his producer. Madame de Pompadour understood the king's dual nature perfectly. She knew he needed the private, comfortable world to escape his own melancholy, and she became the gatekeeper and mistress of ceremonies for that world. She organized the intimate dinners, the private theatricals, the quiet conversations. She was the one who decided who got an invitation to the king's real life. An invitation to sup with the king in the petits appartements became infinitely more valuable than the right to watch him get dressed in the morning. The old nobility, the dukes and princes whose families had served the crown for centuries, were horrified. They were being usurped by a commoner who held power not through birthright, but through her personal connection to the king. The formal, rigid etiquette of Versailles was being bypassed. Why spend years mastering the precise angle at which to bow when you could be undone by a witty woman who made the king laugh over hot chocolate? The court became a nest of competing factions, those in Pompadour's circle, and those who were resentfully on the outside, spending their time writing vicious pamphlets and spreading gossip. The very system Louis XIV had designed to pacify the nobility was now actively creating dissent and bitterness within its ranks. Louis XV reigned for a very long time, and under his watch, France continued to be a centre for art, philosophy and science, much of it championed by Pompadour herself, but the political foundation was cracking. The king, retreating from the public, became a more distant and abstract figure to his people, and the court, once the undeniable centre of the universe, was becoming seen as something else, an insular, expensive, and increasingly irrelevant institution, filled with bitter, bored aristocrats fighting over access to a man who didn't really want to be there. The gilded cage was no longer a symbol of the king's absolute power over his nobles. It was starting to look like a golden albatross around the nation's neck. The rust was beginning to show. And then, after a long, weary reign, Louis XV was gone. The throne passed to his grandson, Louis XVI, in 1774. And if Louis XV was reluctant to play the part of the Sun King, his successor seemed almost constitutionally incapable of it. If you've ever felt like you're in the wrong job, a job you're just not suited for, then you have a deep, spiritual connection to the last Bourbon king of France. Louis XVI was a good man. He was well-meaning, pious, and genuinely wanted the best for his people. He was also painfully shy, cripplingly indecisive, and deeply uncomfortable with the pomp and performance that his role demanded. His passions were quiet, solitary things. He loved geography and naval charts. He loved to hunt, and most famously, he loved locksmithing. He had a private workshop set up near his apartments where he would spend hours meticulously filing keys and crafting intricate locks. It is perhaps a too-on-the-nose metaphor for a man who held all the keys to the kingdom, but couldn't seem to unlock any of its profound and mounting problems. And beside him was his queen, Marie Antoinette. She arrived from Austria as a young, vibrant, and utterly unprepared teenager. She was plunged into the most rigid, most scrutinized court in the world, a place where every glance was analyzed, every word repeated, every friendship a political statement. The etiquette of Versailles, which had been second nature to generations of French nobles, seemed to her a collection of bizarre and nonsensical rules designed to make her life miserable. There's a famous story of her first formal dressing ceremony. She stood shivering in her chemise while the ladies-in-waiting went through a painstaking ritual of precedence to determine who had the right to hand her which article of clothing. A duchess came in, so the task was passed to her. Then a princess of the blood arrived, of even higher rank, so the duchess had to hand the chemise to her. All while the young queen waited, exposed and freezing. To her, this wasn't a sacred ritual demonstrating the hierarchical order of the kingdom. It was just a deeply inefficient and frankly ridiculous way to get dressed. She laughed, and that laughter in the hallowed halls of Versailles was a kind of sin. The couple inherited a court that was already disconnected and bored, and they proceeded to disconnect from it even further. They were young, and they wanted what young people often want: genuine friendship, fun, a life that felt authentic. They quickly grew tired of the endless parade of unfamiliar stiff faces in the grand apartments, so they did what their predecessor had done. But they did it more completely. They retreated. Louis XVI would lock himself away with his maps and his keys. Marie Antoinette, meanwhile, created her own inner sanctum, a circle of close personal friends, most famously the Duchesse de Polignac. They would hold private parties, gamble, put on plays, and create a bubble of intimacy and informality within the vast impersonal palace. This was, in essence, her attempt to build a normal social life. but in the context of Versailles, it was a political disaster. The system of Louis XIV was built on the premise that the monarch's favour was accessible to all nobles, at least in theory, through participation in the court rituals. By retreating into a small, exclusive clique, Marie Antoinette was breaking this fundamental contract. The thousands of other aristocrats at Versailles were now not just bored, they were pointedly excluded. Their presence at court, their raison d'etre was rendered meaningless. They had been snubbed, and a snubbed aristocrat with too much time on their hands is a dangerous thing. They became a cottage industry for gossip. The most vile, scandalous, and often completely fabricated rumours about the Queen began to circulate, first as whispers in the palace corridors, and then as printed poison in the pamphlets of Paris. They painted her as decadent, promiscuous, and most damningly, as a foreign Austrian who was manipulating the weak king and draining the French treasury for her own amusement and that of her favourites. But the ultimate symbol of this royal retreat, the physical embodiment of their rejection of the court, was a small chateau on the grounds of Versailles called the Petit Trianon. Louis XVI gave it to his wife as a gift, a private domain where she could escape the crushing pressures of the main palace, and it became her sanctuary. Here the rules of Versailles did not apply. At the Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette was not the Queen of France. She was simply the lady of the house. Even the king himself could only enter if he was invited. You can understand the appeal. After a day of suffocating ceremony, it must have felt like taking a deep, clean breath of fresh air. She redecorated it in the latest, most fashionable style, one of relative simplicity and comfort. She designed a beautiful English-style garden around it, a stark contrast to the rigid geometric formality of the main Versailles gardens laid out by Lenault. The English garden was meant to look natural, untamed, a celebration of romantic, rustic nature. It was a landscape of personal feeling, not a landscape of absolute power. And within this garden she commissioned the creation of the Hameau de la Reine, the Queen's Hamlet. This was a fully functional, albeit highly idealized, replica of a rustic peasant village. It had a farmhouse, a dairy, a mill, a dovecote, all with charming thatched roofs and picturesque little vegetable patches. Here the Queen and her ladies-in-waiting would dress up in simple muslin dresses and straw hats, and play at being shepherdesses and milkmaids. It was, in its own way, a work of art, but in a country where real peasants were struggling with crop failures and crippling taxes, where the price of bread was spiralling out of control, the image of a queen playing dress-up in a fantasy farm was catastrophic. It wasn't seen as a charming escape, it was seen as a grotesque mockery of the genuine suffering of the French people. The milk pails in the hamlet's dairy were made of exquisite Sèvres porcelain. The sheep were washed and groomed and adorned with silk ribbons before being let out to pasture. It was poverty, repackaged as a luxury experience. It confirmed every suspicion that the monarchy was not only out of touch, but that they inhabited a completely different reality, a dream world built at the expense of a waking nightmare for everyone else. The Petit Trianon's hamlet became a fortress of privacy, but in doing so, it isolated the Queen from the very people she needed to win over, the powerful nobility of her own court. Locked out of her inner circle, their resentment festered. They were the primary source of the rumours that would destroy her reputation. They saw a queen who refused to play her part, who rejected their world and its sacred traditions, and they set out to destroy her in return. The gilded cage, so carefully constructed to contain them, was now being used by its inmates to launch attacks on their own keepers. And then came the scandal that would crystallize all this free-floating resentment and public anger into a single, devastating narrative. It was a story so bizarre, so convoluted, it almost feels like a farce, but it had tragic, world-altering consequences. We call it the affair of the diamond necklace. It began, as so many things do, with a piece of jewellery, a truly ostentatious, breathtakingly expensive piece of jewellery. Two Parisian jewellers, Baume and Bassenger, had spent years collecting the most magnificent diamonds in Europe to create a necklace they hoped to sell to Louis XV for his mistress, Madame du Barry. But the king died before the sale could be made, so now they were stuck with this necklace, a monstrosity of 647 flawless diamonds, weighing over 2,800 carats. Its price was astronomical, roughly equivalent to the entire annual budget of the French Navy. It was, to put it mildly, a difficult item to move. They offered it to the new queen, Marie Antoinette. She was young and known for her love of fashion, so it seemed like a sure bet. But to their surprise, she flatly refused. She was actually trying to scale back her expenses in the face of growing public criticism. She famously replied, "We have more need of battleships than of necklaces," and that should have been the end of it. The jewelers had a very expensive paperweight, and the Queen had made a sensible, fiscally responsible decision. But the story was just beginning. Enter the villain of our piece, a woman named Jeanne de la Motte. She was a descendant of an illegitimate son of a past French king, which gave her a noble name but no money or status. She was a supremely talented grifter, a social climber who survived on charm, audacity, and a complete lack of scruples. She had managed to work her way into the outer fringes of the court, and she saw the necklace as her ticket to the big time. Her mark was the Cardinal de Rohan. He was a member of one of France's most powerful families, but he was in deep disgrace at court. He had desperately fallen out of favour with Marie Antoinette, and was obsessed with finding a way back into her good graces. He was, in other words, the perfect fool, ambitious, desperate, and blindingly gullible. Jeanne de la Motte befriended the cardinal, and convinced him of a complete fabrication that she was a secret, intimate confidante of the Queen. She told him that the Queen secretly desperately wanted the diamond necklace, but couldn't buy it publicly because of the kingdom's finances and the king's disapproval. So she needed a secret intermediary to purchase it on her behalf, and she had chosen him, the Cardinal de Rohan, for this sensitive and important task. He would be her secret agent, and his reward would be her eternal gratitude and a triumphant return to favour. Rohan, blinded by his own ambition, fell for it hook, line and sinker. To seal the deal, Jeanne orchestrated one of the most audacious scenes in the history of confidence tricks. She hired a Parisian prostitute who bore a passing resemblance to Marie Antoinette, dressed her in a white gown, and arranged a clandestine meeting in the gardens of Versailles late one night. In the darkness, the fake queen handed Rohan a rose and murmured a few words of forgiveness and promise. For the cardinal, this was all the proof he needed. He was in. He went to the jewellers and, using his own name and credit, signed a contract to buy the necklace, promising that the Queen would pay in instalments. The jewellers, desperate to unload the necklace, chose to believe him. They handed it over. Jeanne de la Motte's husband immediately took it to London and began breaking it apart, selling the magnificent diamonds one by one on the black market. The scheme, of course, fell apart when the first payment came due. The jewellers, not having heard from the Queen, went to her directly, and you can just imagine the scene. Marie Antoinette, confronted with a bill for an astronomical sum for a necklace she had explicitly and publicly refused to buy, had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. The cardinal was summoned. He produced the forged letters from the Queen that Jeanne had provided him. The whole sordid, ridiculous story came tumbling out. Louis XVI was furious. He had the Cardinal de Rohan arrested in the Hall of Mirrors, in full view of the entire court, and thrown into the Bastille. Jeanne de la Motte was also arrested. Now, a wiser monarch might have tried to hush the whole thing up to handle the scandal quietly, but the king and queen felt their own honour had been attacked. They were the victims of a bizarre crime, and they wanted public vindication. They demanded a full public trial before the Parlement of Paris. This was perhaps the single greatest political miscalculation of their reign. In putting the cardinal on trial, they were inadvertently putting the monarchy itself on trial. The trial became a public sensation. All the dirt and gossip of the court was aired for the entire nation to see. Jeanne de la Motte, a master manipulator, portrayed herself as an innocent pawn caught between a decadent queen and a corrupt cardinal. The cardinal's defence was essentially that he was a fool who had been tricked because it was perfectly believable to him that the Queen of France would engage in secret nocturnal schemes to acquire jewellery she couldn't afford. The public, already conditioned by years of slanderous pamphlets, was inclined to believe the worst of Marie Antoinette. It didn't matter that she was completely innocent. The story was just too good. It fit the narrative they already held in their heads, a frivolous spendthrift foreign queen who cared more for diamonds than for her people. The verdict was a thunderclap. The Parliament, eager to assert its own power against the monarchy, acquitted the Cardinal de Rohan. He was seen as a victim, a dupe. Jeanne de la Motte was found guilty and branded, but she later escaped and wrote her memoirs, filled with even more lurid lies about the Queen, which became bestsellers across Europe. The verdict was a complete humiliation for the monarchy. It was seen as a judgment not on the facts of the case, but on the character of the Queen. In the court of public opinion, she had been found guilty. The affair permanently destroyed what little reputation she had left. It cemented her image as Madame Deficit, the woman who was bankrupting France for her own selfish pleasures. The rust on the gilded cage was no longer just a stain. It was eating through the very bars of the structure. The court of Versailles, once a tool for projecting power, was now a source of national shame, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the old regime. It was an island of unimaginable luxury and bizarre intrigue, floating in a sea of national debt and popular misery, and the tide was rising. The late 1780s saw France lurching from one crisis to another. A series of bad harvests led to a critical shortage of grain. The price of bread, the staple food for the vast majority of the population, soared. While the court was consumed by scandals about diamond necklaces, ordinary people in Paris were literally starving. The disconnect between the reality of life for most French people and the perceived reality of life at Versailles became a chasm of rage. Rumours, born of desperation and stoked by revolutionary pamphlets, spread like wildfire. The court was hoarding grain at Versailles, they said. The Queen had callously remarked, "Let them eat cake," when told the people had no bread. It wasn't true, but it didn't need to be. It felt true. It captured the profound sense that the people in that glittering palace lived in a different world, a world where the suffering of the common man was not only ignored but openly mocked. The dam of centuries of deference and tradition was about to break, and the flood would be aimed squarely at the source of all this perceived injustice, the Palace of Versailles. It happened on the 5th of October, 1789. The day began with the sound of a drum. A young woman, in a market in Paris, began beating a drum, calling out for bread. She was soon joined by others. The crowd of women grew, their anger and desperation feeding on itself. They were fishwives, market stall owners, labourers' wives, the women who had to face their hungry children every night. They stormed the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall, seizing whatever weapons they could find, kitchen knives, pikes, old muskets, and then a single idea took hold of the crowd. The source of the problem wasn't here in Paris. The king was in Versailles, the grain was in Versailles, the solution was in Versailles, and so they began to march, thousands of them, a torrent of angry, determined women, followed by men and National Guardsmen, marching the 12 miles from Paris to Versailles in a driving, miserable autumn rain. You have to try to imagine the sheer sensory shock of their arrival. For over a century, Versailles had been a bubble, a carefully manicured dreamscape protected from the harsh realities of the outside world. The only sounds were the gentle splashing of fountains, the polite murmur of courtly conversation, the strains of an orchestra. And now, this, the sound of thousands of voices shouting for bread, the tramp of muddy feet on the pristine cobblestones, the sight of thousands of ordinary furious people armed with makeshift weapons, flooding the courtyards and pressing against the golden gates. Reality, in its most brutal and undeniable form, had arrived at the palace doorstep. Inside, there was chaos and disbelief. The court was in session. The king was out hunting. When the news arrived, he rushed back. The courtiers, who lived their lives by a rulebook of etiquette, had no protocol for this. How do you respond to a hungry mob? What is the proper way to address a fishwife wielding a pike? For hours there was a standoff. The king met with a delegation of the women and promised to release all the grain stores in Versailles. But it wasn't enough. The crowd didn't trust him. They decided to stay the night, camping out in the courtyards, their campfires casting a flickering, ominous glow on the palace walls. In the early hours of the morning, the situation exploded. A small group of marchers found an unlocked gate and poured into the palace. The carefully constructed barrier between the world of the court and the world of the people was breached. They surged through the gilded corridors, their muddy boots staining the polished floors. They overwhelmed the royal bodyguards in a bloody, violent struggle. Their primary target was the Queen. "We'll cut off her head," they screamed. "Tear out her heart. Make a stew of her liver." Marie Antoinette was asleep in her bedchambers. She was awoken by the screams of her ladies-in-waiting just moments before the mob broke down her door. She fled, half-dressed, through a series of secret passages that had been built into the walls of the Queen's apartments, a hidden world designed for courtly intrigue. now being used for a desperate flight for her life. She made it to the king's chambers just as the mob was splintering the doors of her own bedroom with axes, plunging their pikes and bayonets into the mattress where she had been sleeping moments before. The royal family was now trapped, huddled together in the king's main apartment, listening to the sounds of the mob rampaging through their home. The Palace of Versailles, the ultimate symbol of absolute power, had become their prison. By dawn, the Marquis de Lafayette, commander of the National Guard, managed to restore a semblance of order, but the crowd outside was still vast, angry, and not going anywhere. They had a new demand now, a single chant that rose from thousands of throats: to Paris, to Paris. They did not trust the king to keep his promises from a distance. They wanted him in Paris, in the city, where they could keep an eye on him. Lafayette went to the king. He told him there was no choice. To pacify the crowd, he had to show himself. And so Louis XVI, the absolute monarch by divine right, stepped out onto the central balcony of the palace, the very one overlooking the marble courtyard, and stood before the mob. A few moments later, the crowd began to chant for the Queen. The Austrian, the Austrian. They screamed for her. Her advisors begged her not to go. They were afraid she would be shot, but she knew she had to. With her 2 young children, she stepped out onto the balcony to face the thousands of people who hated her. The crowd shouted for the children to be taken away. They wanted her alone. She sent them back inside, and for what must have felt like an eternity, Marie Antoinette stood there, alone on the balcony, a solitary figure in white, facing a sea of weapons and rage. She could not speak over the noise. Instead, she did the only thing she could. She sank into a deep, slow, formal curtsy, the kind of gesture she had so often found ridiculous. A curtsy to the people of France. It was a gesture of profound submission. The mob, stunned into a moment of silence by the sheer bravery of the act, lowered their weapons. A few voices cried out, "Vive la reine! Long live the Queen!" But it changed nothing. Lafayette appeared on the balcony and announced to the crowd that the king had agreed to their demand. The royal family would be leaving Versailles. They would be moving to Paris. A great cheer went up. They had won. The journey back to Paris was the funeral procession for absolute monarchy. The royal carriage was surrounded by the crowd. At the front on pikes were the severed heads of the 2 bodyguards who had been killed defending the Queen's apartments. The women marched alongside, singing joyfully, carrying loaves of bread impaled on their bayonets. They were, as they put it, bringing the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy back to Paris. The king was no longer a divine ruler. He was a commodity, the guarantor of bread. They arrived at the Tuileries Palace in Paris, a dark, long-abandoned royal residence. As Marie Antoinette walked through the dilapidated rooms, she turned to her son, the Dauphin. "It's ugly here, Mama," he said. "My son," she replied. "Louis XIV lived here and was content. We must not be more difficult than he was." But they were not there as residents. They were there as prisoners. They would never see Versailles again. And what of the palace? After the royal family's forced departure, an eerie silence fell over Versailles. The heart had been ripped out of it. A few courtiers lingered for a while, like ghosts in the echoing halls, but soon they too drifted away. The great machine ground to a halt. The doors were locked. The shutters were drawn. The thousands of clocks which the king had so loved to wind stopped ticking, one by one. The gilded cage was now just an empty cage. The performance was over. The audience had gone home. The light that had once poured from its windows, a beacon of power and culture for all of Europe, was extinguished, leaving only the quiet darkness and the rustle of autumn leaves in the vast empty gardens. The unblinking eye of protocol had finally closed, and the world it had watched over for so long had simply vanished. And in the stillness of the Hall of Mirrors, you could almost hear the profound, deep silence of an era coming to its end, a silence that lets you drift and float, and fall ever so gently into sleep.